The Secrets of a Legendary Stick-Up Man. Just before Forrest Tucker turned 79, he went to work for the last time. Although he was still a striking-looking man, with intense blue eyes and swept-back white hair, he had a growing list of ailments, including high blood pressure and burning ulcers. He had already had a quadruple bypass, and his wife encouraged him to settle into their home in Pompano Beach, Florida, a peach-colored house on the edge of a golf course which they'd purchased for their retirement. There was a place nearby where they could eat prime rib and dance on Saturday nights with other seniors for $15.50 a person, and even a lake where Tucker could sit by the shore and practice his saxophone. But on this spring day in 1999, while his neighbors were on the fairway or tending to their grandchildren, he drove to the Republic Security Bank in Jupiter, about 50 miles from his home. Tucker, who took pride in his appearance, was dressed all in white pants with a sharp crease, a white sports shirt, white suede shoes, and a shimmering white ascot. He paused briefly in front of the ATM and pulled the ascot up around his face, bandit style. He then reached into a canvas bag, took out an old U.S. Army Colt .45 and burst into the bank. He went up to the first teller and said, "Put your money on the counter, all of it." He flashed the gun so that everyone could see it. The teller laid several packets of 5s and 20s on the counter, and Tucker inspected them for exploding die packs. Checking his watch, he turned to the next teller and said, "Get over here. You too." Then he gathered up the thick packets, more than $5,000, and hurried to the door. On his way out, he looked back at the two tellers. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you." He drove to a nearby lot where he had left a safe car, a red Grand AM that couldn't be traced to him. After wiping down the stolen hot car with a rag, he threw his belongings inside the Grand AM. They included a .357 Magnum, a sawed-off .30 carbine, 2 black nylon caps, a holster akin of mace, a pair of Smith & Wesson handcuffs, 2 rolls of black electrical tape, a police badge, 5 AAA batteries, a police scanner, a glass cutter, gloves, and a fishing cap. There was also a small bottle of medicine for his heart. No one seemed to notice him, and he went home, making what appeared to be a clean getaway. After a brief stop to count the money, he got back in the car and headed out again. As he approached the golf course, the bills neatly stacked beside him, he noticed an unmarked car on his tail. He turned onto another street just to make sure. There it was again. Then he spotted a police car pulling out behind him. He hit the gas as hard as he could, trying to outmaneuver them, turning left, then right, then left. He went past the North Pompano Baptist Church and the Creer Funeral Home, past a row of pink one-story houses with speedboats in the driveways, until he found himself on a dead-end street. As he spun around, he saw that a police car was barricading the road. One of the officers, Captain James Chin, was reaching for his shotgun. There was a small gap between Chin's car and a wooden fence, and Tucker, his body pitched forward in his seat, sped toward it. Chin, who had spent almost 2 decades as a detective, later said he had never seen anything like it. The white-haired figure barreling toward him seemed to be smiling, as if he were enjoying the showdown. Then, as the car skidded over the embankment, Tucker lost control and hit a palm tree. The airbags inflated, pinning him against the seat. The police were stunned when they realized that the man they had apprehended was not only 78 years old. He looked, according to Chin, as if he had just come from an early bird special, but one of the most notorious stick-up men of the 20th century. Over a career that spanned more than 6 decades, he had also become perhaps the greatest escape artist of his generation, a human contortionist who had broken out of nearly every prison he was confined in. One day in 2002, I went to meet Tucker in Fort Worth, Texas, where he was being held in a prison medical center after pleading guilty to 1 count of robbery and receiving a 13-year sentence. The hospital, An old yellow brick building with a red tiled roof was on top of a hill and set back off the main road, surrounded by armed guards and razor wire. I was handed a notice that said no weapons, ammunition, or metal-cutting tools were allowed, and then escorted through a series of chambers, each door sealing behind us before the next one opened, until I arrived in an empty waiting room. Before long, a man appeared in a wheelchair pushed by a guard. He wore brown prison fatigues and a green jacket with a turned-up collar. His figure was twisted forward, as if he had tried to contort it one last time and it had frozen in place. As he rose from the wheelchair, he said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Forrest Tucker." His voice was gentle with a soft southern lilt. After he extended his hand, he made his way slowly over to a wooden table with the help of a walker. "I'm sorry we have to meet here," he said, waiting for me to sit first. Captain Chin had told me that he had never met such a gracious criminal. "If you see him, tell him Captain Chin says hi." Even a juror who helped convict him once remarked, "You got to hand it to the guy, he's got style." "So what do you want to know?" Tucker said. "I've been in prison all my life, except for the times I've broken out. I was born in 1920, and I was in jail by the time I was 15. I'm 81 now and I'm still in jail, but I've broken out 18 times successfully and 12 times unsuccessfully. There were plenty of other times I planned to escape, but there's no point in me telling you about them." As we sat in a corner by a window overlooking the prison yard, it was hard to imagine that this man's career had featured wanted posters and midnight escapes. His fingers were knotted like bamboo, and he wore bifocals. "What I mean by a successful escape is to elude custody," he continued, squinting out the window. "Maybe they'd eventually get me, but I got away at least for a few minutes." He pointed to the places along his arm where he had been shot while trying to flee. "I still have part of a bullet in me," he said. "They all opened up on me and hit me 3 times in both shoulders with M16 rifles and with buckshot in the legs." His voice sounded dry, and I offered to buy him a drink from the vending machine. He followed me and peered through the glass without touching it. He chose a Dr. Pepper. "That's kind of like cherry soda, isn't it?" He seemed pleased. When I gave him the drink, he glanced at the candy bars, and I asked him if he wanted anything else. "If it's not too much trouble," he said, "I'd like a Mounds." After he finished eating, he began to tell me what he called the true story of Forrest Tucker. He spoke for hours, and when he grew tired, he offered to continue the next morning. During our conversations, which went on for several days, we always sat in the corner by the window, and after a while he would cough slightly and I would offer to buy him a drink. Each time he followed me to the machine as the guard watched from a distance. It was only during the last trip to the machine, when I dropped some money, that I noticed his eyes were moving over everything: the walls, the windows, the guard, the fences, the razor wire. It occurred to me that Tucker, escape artist par excellence, had been using our meetings to case the joint. "The first time I broke out of the can I was only 15, Tucker told me. "At 15, you're pretty fast." It was the spring of 1936, and he had been incarcerated for stealing a car in Stuart, Florida, a small town along the St. Lucie River which had been devastated during the Depression. He told the police that he took it just for a thrill, but as he sat in jail, the thrill gave way to panic, and when a jailer removed his chains, he darted out. Several days later, a deputy discovered him in an orange grove, eating a piece of fruit. "That was escape number 1, Tucker says. Such as it was. The sheriff decided to transfer him to reform school. During his brief flight, however, Tucker had slipped a half-dozen hacksaw blades through the cell window to a group of boys he had met inside. They hadn't broken out yet and still had the blades," he says. "That night, after sawing a bar, he slithered out, helping 2 other boys squeeze through the tiny opening. Unlike the others, Tucker knew the area. As a kid, He had spent a fair amount of time by the river, and it was in the river that the police found him and another boy about an hour later, hiding with just their noses above water. The next day, the Stuart Daily News detailed his exploits under the headline "Trio escaped by sawing bars of cell last night supplied with hacksaws, cold chisels and files by boy." That was escape number 2, Tucker says. A brief one. Like the outlaws he read about in dime novels who were forced into banditry by some perceived injustice. Tucker says that the legend of Forrest Tucker began on the morning when he was unfairly sent away for only a minor theft. The story, which he repeated even as a boy, eventually spread throughout the town, and over time the details became more ornate, the theft more minor. Morris Walton, who used to play with Tucker as a child, says, "My sense is he spent his life in jail for stealing a bicycle and simply trying to escape. If he became bad, it was only because the system made him that way." What Walton knew of Tucker's upbringing reinforced that impression. His father was a heavy equipment operator who disappeared when Tucker was 6. While his mother struggled in menial jobs in Miami, Tucker was sent to live with his grandmother, who was the tender of the bridge in Stuart. There he built canoes and sailboats out of scrap metal and wood, which he gathered along the riverbank, and taught himself to play the saxophone and the clarinet. "It wasn't like I needed a father to order me around," he says. But as his reputation for cleverness grew, so did his rap sheet. By his 16th birthday, it included charges of breaking and entering and simple larceny. After he escaped from reform school and fled to Georgia, he was sentenced to be placed and confined at labor in the chain gang. Like all new inmates, he was taken to the blacksmith, where a chain was riveted around both of his ankles. The steel gradually ate into the skin, a condition known as shackle poisoning. The guards would give you the first 3 days to let you get your hands broken in with calluses, Tucker recalls. But after that the walking boss would punish you, hit you with his cane or fist. And if you didn't work hard enough, the guards would take you in the bathroom and tie your hands behind your back and put a pressure hose in your face and hold it there until you'd sputter and you couldn't breathe. Although Tucker was released after only 6 months, he was soon convicted again for stealing another car and sentenced to 10 years. By now, we see a man who has been thoroughly cast out by society, Tucker's lawyer later wrote in a court motion. Marked as a criminal at 17 years old and constantly railroaded through judicial proceedings without the benefit of counsel, Forrest Tucker was becoming an angry young man. Tucker himself says, "The die was cast." In photographs taken after he was paroled at the age of 24, his hair is cut short and he has on a white t-shirt. His once slender arms are coiled with muscles. His eyes are piercing. People who knew him say that he was extraordinarily charismatic, that girls flocked around him, but they also noted a growing reservoir of anger. "I think he had this desperate need to show the world that he was somebody," one of his relatives says. At first, Tucker sought work playing the saxophone in big bands around Miami, and he seemed to have harbored ambitions of becoming another Glenn Miller. Nothing came of it, though, and after a brief failed marriage, he put away his sax and got himself a gun. The outlaw in the American imagination is a subject of romance, a good, bad man. He is typically a master of escape, a crack shot, a ladies' man. In 1915, when the police asked the train robber Frank Ryan why he did it, he replied, "Bad companions and dime novels. Jesse James was my favorite hero." When Tucker was growing up during the Great Depression, the appeal of bank robbers, fueled by widespread anger over defaults and foreclosures, was reaching its zenith. After the FBI gunned down John Dillinger in 1934, droves descended on the scene, mopping up his blood with their clothes. At least 10 Hollywood films were devoted to Dillinger's life. One of them exclaimed, "His story is written in bullets, blood, and blondes." Because the holdup demands a public performance, it tends to draw a certain personality, bold, vainglorious, reckless. At the same time, most bank robbers know that the society that revels in their exploits will ultimately demand their elimination by incarceration or death. "They'll get me," Pretty Boy Floyd once said. "Sooner or later, I'll go down full of lead." That's how it will end. Indeed, by the time Tucker set out to become an outlaw in the late 1940s, most of the legendary stick-up men had already been gunned down. Still, he began to imitate their style, dressing in chalk-striped suits and two-tone shoes, and he would stand in front of a mirror, pointing a gun at his own reflection. Finally, on September 22, 1950, with a handkerchief tied over his face and a gun drawn in the style of Jesse James, he strode into a bank in Miami and made off with $1,278. A few days later, he went back to the same place, this time for the entire safe. He was apprehended as he was trying to crack it open with a blowtorch on the roadside. His career seemed even more fleeting than that of most bank robbers, but in the county jail Tucker decided he was more than an ordinary stick-up man. "It didn't matter to me if they gave me 5 years, 10 years, or life," he says. "I was an escape artist." He searched the prison for what he called the weak spot. One day around Christmas, after weeks of looking, he began to moan in pain. The authorities rushed him to the hospital, where doctors removed his appendix. "A small price to pay," Tucker says. While convalescing, still chained to his bed, he started to work on the shackles. He had taught himself how to pick a lock using almost anything: a pen, a paper clip, a piece of wire, nail clippers, a watch spring, and after a few minutes he walked out unnoticed. He made his way to California, where he went on a spree of robberies, hurtling over counters, pointing his gun and declaring, "I mean business." He wore bright checkered suits and sped away in a flamboyant getaway car with tubes along the sides. He even talked like a character in Pulp Fiction. "This is a stick-up, girls," he once said, according to witnesses. "I've got a gun, be quiet and you won't get hurt." Hoping to improve his take, Tucker began to cast about for a partner. "I didn't want any nuts or rats," he says, adding, "I'm from the old school." In the end, he found an ex-con named Richard Bellew, a tall, handsome thief with a high IQ and wavy black hair. Like Tucker, Bellew modeled himself on the stick-up men of the 1930s, and he ran with a stage dancer named Jet Blanca. But Tucker chose him for another reason. "He always let me count the dough." They began to hit one bank after another. After one heist, witnesses said the last thing they saw was a row of suits hanging in the back seat of the getaway car. The heists, which continued for 2 years, dominated the local headlines, often preempting coverage of the 1952 presidential election and the McCarthy hearings. Tucker and Bellew were depicted as armed men who terrorized their victims, but also as dramatically attired, hold-up artists who expertly stripped the tellers of cash, leaving behind only an impression of competent banditry and one getaway car. On March 20, 1953, more than 2 years after Tucker's escape from the hospital, FBI agents surrounded him as he was retrieving loot from a safe deposit box in San Francisco. Then they went to search the place Tucker had listed as his residence. There, in a spacious apartment in San Mateo, they found a young blonde woman who said she had never heard of Forrest Tucker. She was married to a wealthy songwriter, she said, who commuted daily to the city, and they had just moved into a bigger apartment to make room for their 5-month-old son. Her husband's name, she told the police, was Richard Bellew. Yet when the officers showed Shirley Bellew a photograph of the bank robber and longtime prison fugitive Forrest Tucker, she burst into tears. "I can't believe it," she said. "He was such a good man, such a good provider." She recalled how her husband would come home every night and play with their baby, whom they had named Rick Bellew Jr. "What's going to become of our little baby?" she asked. "What's his name going to be?" "Let me tell you about Alcatraz," Tucker said one day as he sat in the corner of the visiting room, his walker resting against his leg. He had spread a napkin out in front of him and was eating a meatball hero I'd brought him and sipping a Dr. Pepper. There were only 1,576 people who ever went there. I was no. 1047. Alcatraz, or the Rock, had been converted from a military prison in 1934 as a way to confine the country's most notorious criminals, including George "Machine Gun" Kelly, Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, and Mickey Cohen. At least half of the inmates had previously attempted to break out of other prisons. Surrounded by the freezing San Francisco Bay and its deadly currents, it was built to be escape-proof. Al Capone, who was sent there in 1934, is said to have told the warden, "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked." Tucker arrived on September 3, 1953. He was 33. He had been sentenced to 30 years. In his prison photo, he still has on a jacket and tie. His brown hair is brushed back with a touch of oil. He is slightly unshaved but still striking. Within moments, he was stripped naked, and a medical attendant probed his ears and nose and mouth and rectum, searching for any tools or weapons. He was given a blue chambray shirt with his number stamped on it and a pair of trousers, as well as a cap, a peacoat, a bathrobe, 3 pairs of socks, 2 handkerchiefs, a pair of shoes, and a raincoat. His cell was so narrow that he could reach out and touch both sides at the same time. It was so cold in the cell block you had to sleep with your coat and hat to stay warm, Tucker says. As he lay in bed, he says, he thought about his wife and child. He remembered the first time he met Shirley Storrs at an event for singles in Oakland. He remembered how they skied at Lake Tahoe and were married in a small ceremony in September of 1951, how she sang in a choral group, and how he'd sit and listen for hours. And he remembered his son being born. "We loved each other," Tucker says of his wife. "I didn't know how to explain to her the truth that this was my way of life." Several weeks after he arrived, a guard roused him from his cell and led him into a tiny room that had a small window. Peering through it, he saw his wife sitting on the other side. He picked up the phone. "It was hard to talk," he recalls. "We had to look at each other through a piece of glass. She told me she had to make a life for herself. I said, the best thing you can do is make a life for you and our son. I told her, I won't bother you no matter what, no matter how much I want to. I won't ring your phone." A few months later, he received notice that their marriage had been annulled. By now, Tucker had developed several maxims, including, the more security, the more bizarre the method of escape must be. He began to concoct elaborate schemes with a fellow inmate named Teddy Green, an escape artist and bank robber who had once dressed as a priest to elude the police, and had broken out of the state penitentiary by shipping himself out in a box of rags. Along with another inmate, they started smuggling tools from their prison jobs, hiding them in the laundry, and planting pieces of steel wool on other prisoners to set off the metal detectors, so that the guards assumed they were broken. They carved holes in their toilet bowls and tucked the tools inside, putting putty over them. At night, they used the tools to tunnel through the floor, planning to go out by means of the basement. One day, according to internal prison records, a prisoner in solitary suggested that guards examine the cell toilets. Soon a full-scale search was launched. A warden's report summed up the findings. The result of the shakedown of these toilets was the blow torch as I have mentioned, a bar spreader, a pair of side cutters, a brace and some bits, a screwdriver and 1 or 2 pieces of wire and a piece of carborundum stone. All 3 prisoners were labeled very dangerous escape risks and locked in the treatment unit, better known as the hole. I remember walking in with no clothes or shoes on, Tucker says. The steel floor was so cold it hurt to touch it. The only way to stay warm was to keep walking. One night he heard a haunting sound through the window. He couldn't see anyone outside, but he heard voices from below. They were the guards' children singing carols. It was the first children's voices I had heard in years, he says. It was Christmas Eve. As the time passed, Tucker began to teach himself the law, and before long he was deluging the court with appeals, which he wrote in a slanting, methodical print. Although a prosecutor later dismissed one of his writs as pure fantasy, he was granted a hearing in November of 1956. According to Tucker, as well as court records, the night before his court appearance, while being held in the county jail, he complained of pains in his kidneys and was rushed to the hospital. Guards were stationed at every door. When no one was looking, Tucker broke a pencil and stabbed his ankle. Because of the wound, the guards removed his leg irons, strapping him to the gurney with his hands cuffed. As he was being wheeled into the X-ray room, Tucker leaped up, overpowered 2 guards, and ran out the door. For several hours, he enjoyed the fresh air and the sight of ordinary people. He was apprehended, still in his hospital gown and handcuffs, in the middle of a cornfield. The brief escape, for which he was tried and convicted, enhanced his reputation as an escape artist. Yet it was not for another 23 years, after Tucker had been released and arrested again for armed robbery, that he made his greatest escape. In the summer of 1979, while at San Quentin, a maximum security facility that jutted out into the ocean and was known among cons as the Gladiator School, Tucker took a job in the prison industries, and with the help of 2 other inmates, John Waller and William McGurk, secretly gathered together scraps of wood and sheets of formica, which they cut into strange shapes and hid under tarps. From the electrical shop, they spirited away 2 6-foot poles and several buckets. Then in the furniture workshop, they found the final pieces, plastic dust covers, paint, and tape, which they stored in boxes labeled office supplies. On August 9th, after months of preparation, Tucker exchanged nods with both of his confederates in the yard, signaling that everything was ready. While Waller and McGurk stood watch outside the lumber shop, Tucker drew on his childhood experience and began to fashion the pieces into a 14-foot kayak. A hammer was too loud, so I had to use only tape and bolts, Tucker says. He had just enough paint for one side of the craft, the side that would face the guard towers, and as the others urged him to hurry, he stenciled on it "Rubadub-dub." Waller, who called the 59-year-old Tucker the old man, later told a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, "The boat was beautiful. I wish my eyes were as blue as that boat." They wore sailor hats and sweatshirts that Tucker had painted bright orange, with the logo of the Marin Yacht Club which he had seen on the boats that sailed by. When the guard wasn't looking, they hurriedly put the kayak into the water. As they set out, the winds were blowing more than 20 miles an hour, and massive swells began to swamp the kayak. "The boat didn't leak a drop," Waller said. "We could have paddled to Australia. It was those damn waves over the side." When we finally reached the edge of the property at San Quentin, the son of a bitch sank. A guard in one of the towers spotted them clinging to the upside-down craft, kicking to shore, and asked if they needed help. They said they were fine, and as if to prove it, McGurk held up his wrist and yelled, "We just lost a couple of oars, but my Timex is still running." The guard, unaware that 3 prisoners were missing, laughed and went back to his lookout. California soon unleashed a statewide manhunt. Meanwhile, police in Texas and Oklahoma began to report a strange series of holdups. They all had the same MO. 3 or 4 men would stroll into a grocery store or a bank, flash a gun, demand the money, and speed away in a stolen car. Witnesses invariably noted that they were all, by the standards of the trade, old men. One even wore what appeared to be a hearing aid. The authorities compared them to the elderly thieves in the film Going in Style, and dubbed them the Overthehel Gang. "That was when I was really a good robber," Tucker tells me. He is careful not to admit to any particular crime. I don't know if they still have jurisdiction, or implicate any of his living partners. Some of them are still out there. but he says that by the age of 60, he had at last mastered the art of the holdup. One day, while we were sitting in the prison visiting room, Tucker leaned forward in his chair and began to teach me how to rob a bank. "First of all, you want a place near the highway," he said, putting on his bifocals, his eyes blinking as if he were imagining a particular layout. "Then you need to case it. You can't just storm in. You need to size it up, know it like your own home. In the old days, the stick-up men were like cowboys," he continued. "They would just go in shooting, yelling for everyone to lie down. But to me, violence is the first sign of an amateur." The best hold-up men, in his view, were like stage actors, able to hold a room by the sheer force of their personality. Some even wore makeup and practiced getting into character. "There is an art to robbing a bank if you do it right," Tucker said. Whereas he once cultivated a flamboyant image, he later developed, he said, a subtler, more natural style. "Okay, the tools," he pressed on. "Ideally," he said, "you needed nail polish or superglue to cover your fingertips. You can wear gloves, but in warmer climates they only draw attention. A glass cutter, a holster, a canvas bag big enough for the dough, and a gun, a .38 or semi-automatic or whatever you can get your hands on." He said the gun was just a prop, but essential to any operation. There was one other thing, he said after a pause. It was the key to the success of the Overthehel gang and what he still called the Forrest Tucker trademark, the hearing aid. It was actually a police scanner, he said, which he wired through his shirt. That way he would know if any silent alarms had been triggered. He removed a napkin from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Once you've got your cool car parked nearby, you've got your radio, your hands are covered with gloves or superglue, you walk in. Go right up to the manager. Say, 'Sit down.' Never pull the gun, just flash it. Tell him calmly you're here to rob the bank and it better go off without a hitch. Don't run from the bank unless you're being shot at, 'cause it only shows something is going on. Just walk to the hot car real calm, then drive to the cool car. Rev it up and you're gone." After he finished, he seemed satisfied. "I've just given you a manual on how to rob a bank," he said. He reflected on this for a moment, then added, "No one can teach you the craft. You can only learn by doing." A 40-year-old sergeant on the Austin police force, John Hunt, was assigned to investigate the mysterious holdups of the Overthehel gang. "They were the most professional, successful robbers that I ever encountered in all my years on the force," Hunt, who is now retired after a 30-year career, told me. "They had more experience in robbery than we had catching them." Then a chainsmoker with a drooping mustache and a slight paunch, Hunt spent long days trying to catch the gang. With the advent of high-tech security, there were fewer and fewer traditional bank robbers. Most were desperate drug addicts who made off with only a few $1,000s before they were caught. The members of the Overthehel gang seemed to defy not just their age but their era. "They'd get up every day and be on the job," Hunt said. "Just as a welder gets good at welding, or a writer gets good over the years by writing, these guys learned from their mistakes." In a one-year span, the Overthehel gang was suspected in at least 60 robberies in Oklahoma and Texas, 20 in the Dallas, Fort Worth area alone. The gang was also believed to be responsible for holdups in New Mexico, Arizona, and Louisiana. "Senior citizens strike again," one headline blared. "Middle-aged bandits puzzle detectives," another read. In December of 1980, Hunt and 40 other law enforcement officers from at least 3 states held a conference in Dallas to figure out how to stop them. "You can't say how many lives they altered by sticking a gun in someone's face," a former FBI agent told me. Tucker seemed unable to stop, no matter how much money he accumulated. Although there are no official estimates, Tucker, relying on an array of aliases, including Robert Tuck McDougal, Bob Stone, Russell Johns, Ralph Prout, Forrest Brown, J.C. Tucker, and Ricky Tucker, is believed over his career to have stolen millions of dollars, a fleet of sports cars, a bag of yen, and one Sambo's wooden nickel. In the spring of 1983, he embarked on his most audacious heist yet, robbing a high-security bank in Massachusetts in broad daylight by pretending that he and his men were guards making a routine pickup in an armored car. Tucker believed the plan was a breakthrough in the art. On March 7th, moments before the armored car was scheduled to arrive, they put on makeup and mustaches. Tucker's wig had shrunk in a recent snowstorm, and rather than postpone the operation, he decided to do without it. The teller buzzed them in. Just as they were entering the vault, according to a police report, the manager noticed that the dark mustache on one man and the white mustache on the other man were not real. One of the guards patted his gun and said, "This is a holdup." Tucker locked the manager and two tellers inside the vault and escaped with more than $430,000. But when the police showed the tellers a series of mug shots, they identified, for the first time, the leader of the Overthehill gang as the same man who had broken out of San Quentin in a homemade kayak 3 years earlier. As the FBI, the local police, and the county sheriffs all tried to track him down, Tucker hid in Florida, checking in daily with Teddy Green, his old Alcatraz confidant. One June morning, Tucker pulled into Green's garage and waited while his friend walked toward the car. "I was looking at him," Tucker recalls, thinking, "My, what a sharp suit." A man jumped in front of Tucker's car and yelled, "FBI, don't move, you're under arrest." Agents were everywhere, coming out of cars and bushes. Tucker glowered at Green, convinced that his friend had ratted me out. Although Tucker insists that he never had a pistol and none was ever found, several agents said they saw one in his hand. "He's got a gun," one of them yelled, diving to the ground. The garage filled with the sound of gunfire. Bullets shattered the windshield and the radiator. Tucker, who had been hit in both arms and in the leg, ducked below the dashboard and pressed the accelerator, crashing outside the garage. He opened the car door and stumbled onto the street, his hands and face covered in blood. A woman with 2 children was driving toward him. "As I got closer," the woman later testified, "he started to look bloodier and bloodier. It was all over him, and I thought, this poor man has been hit by a car." She offered him a ride, and he climbed into the passenger seat. Then in her rearview mirror she saw someone holding a rifle, and her 6-year-old son cried out, "Criminal." When she hesitated, Tucker grabbed the wheel and snapped, "I have a gun, now drive." Her son began to sob. After a half-mile chase, they veered down a deadened street. At a muttered "okay" from Tucker, the woman scrambled out of the car and dragged her children to safety. Then Tucker himself stepped from the car and passed out. A columnist for the Miami Herald summed up the capture of the longtime prison fugitive and leader of the Overthehill gang this way: "There is something vaguely appealing about Tucker. Old guys are not regularly associated with high crimes. Tucker must also be admired, in a twisted way I admit, for pulling off an incredible escape from San Quentin prison in San Francisco. Tucker might have made a fortune selling the escape yarn to Hollywood and holing up somewhere. Instead, he chose to resume the line of work to which he was dedicated. The aging Robin Hood took from the rich, who were probably loaded with insurance. Tucker's story had, at last, acquired the burnish of outlaw mythology. The battered Rubadubdub had been donated to the Marin Yacht Club and was later placed in a prison museum, and the Children's Hospital Medical Center in Oakland requested that Tucker be allowed to serve as Grand Marshal for its upcoming bathtub regatta. Amid the clamor, the FBI showed up at a fancy retirement community in Lauderhill, Florida, where Tucker was believed to have been living. An elegant woman in her 50s answered the door. When they asked her about Forrest Tucker, she said she had never heard of the man. She was married to Bob Callahan, a successful stockbroker whom she had met shortly after her first husband died. When the agents explained that Bob Callahan was really Forrest Tucker, a man who had broken out of jail 4 years earlier, she looked at them in tears. "I told him, I don't believe a word you're saying," she recalled nearly 2 decades later. But they had him. They shot him 3 times. An heiress to a modest moving company fortune who looked, in her youth, a bit like Marilyn Monroe, she remembers meeting Tucker at the Whale and Porpoise, a private club on Oakland Park Boulevard. She had never encountered anyone so kind and gallant. "He came over and asked me to dance, and that was that," she told me. She recalled how she went to see him in prison, still in a daze, not sure what to say or do. When she saw him lying there, pale and bloodied, she was overcome with love for this man who, she learned, had been in a chain gang at 16. As he begged her forgiveness, she told me, "All I wanted to do was hold him." At first, awaiting trial in Miami, Tucker tried to break out of jail, removing a bar in his cell with a hacksaw and climbing onto the roof with a homemade grappling hook. But after his wife promised, to the consternation of her family and friends, to stay with him if he reformed, Tucker vowed to rehabilitate himself. "I told her that from then on I'd only look at ways to escape," he says, adding, "She is one in a million." He returned to San Quentin, where he was nicknamed the Captain, and where, for the first time, his seemingly impervious constitution began to show its age. In 1986, he underwent a quadruple bypass. Although guards stood by the door in case he tried to escape, he now considered himself strictly a legal contortionist. Years earlier, at Alcatraz, he had written an appeal that went all the way to the Supreme Court, in which he successfully argued that a judge could not, at sentencing, take into account prior convictions received when the defendant lacked counsel. "It is time we become just a little realistic in the face of a record such as this one," Justice Harry A. Blackmun wrote in an angry dissent. Now, with his failing health, Tucker unleashed another flurry of appeals, getting his sentence reduced by more than half. "This is to thank you," he wrote one judge. "It's the first break I ever got in my life. I won't ever need another." He began to pour all his energy into what he saw as the culmination of his life as an outlaw, a Hollywood movie. Tucker had seen all sorts of films that echoed his life, among them I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, Escape from Alcatraz, and Bonnie and Clyde, and he wanted at last to see his story enshrined in the American imagination. He began to put his exploits down on paper, 5 pages at a time. "No one could have written this inside story of the Rock and what really happened there unless they had personally lived it," he wrote. He devoted 261 pages to Alcatraz, the true story, while working on a second, more ambitious account, which he titled The Can Opener. In it, he described himself as a throwback to the highly intelligent, nonviolent type of criminal in the Willie Sutton mold, and more grandly, as a kind of heroic underdog pitted against a vast and oppressive system. Tucker's obsession with freedom and escape has transformed itself into gamesmanship, he wrote. This is his way of keeping his sanity in a lifetime of being the hunted. Each new joint is a game to outwit the authorities. In 1993, he was released at the age of 73 and settled into the peach-colored house in Pompano Beach, which his wife had bought for them. He polished his manuscript and set up a music room in the den, where he gave saxophone and clarinet lessons for $25 an hour. "We had a wonderful life," his wife said. Tucker recalls. "We used to go out dancing. She'd dress up real pretty and I'd show her off." He composed music for her. "He has all these talents that had been wasted all these years," she told me. "From time to time he played in local jazz clubs. I got used to being free," he says. But his manuscript failed to captivate people as he had hoped it would. I called Clint Eastwood's secretary, but she said, "Unless you have an agent, he won't read it." And the author of The Can Opener increasingly seemed trapped, an ordinary old man. Then came the day in 1999 when, At the age of 78, he painted his fingertips with nail polish, pulled his white ascot up over his face, and burst into the Republic Security Bank with his gun. He didn't do it for the money, his wife said. We had a new car, nice home, paid for, beautiful clothes. He had everything. I think he wanted to become a legend like Bonnie and Clyde, said Captain Chin, who apprehended him after what was believed to be his fourth recent robbery in the Florida area. A court psychologist who examined Tucker noted, "I have seen many individuals who are self-aggrandizing, and that would like to make their mark in history. But none, I must admit, that I heard that would want to, other than in the movies, go out in a blaze in a bank robbery. It is beyond the realm of psychological prediction." After Tucker's arrest, the police put him in semi-isolation, fearing that even at 78 he might somehow elude them. Despite his lawyer's pleas that his client could die under such conditions, he was denied bail. Ordinarily, I would not consider a 78-year-old man a flight risk or a danger to the community, the magistrate said, but Mr. Tucker has proved himself to be remarkably agile. On October 20, 2000, just before his case was scheduled to go to trial, and with his wife looking on, Tucker pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 13 years. At one point, I found a report that the Department of Corrections had compiled, detailing Tucker's life. After pages listing his dramatic holdups and daredevil escapes, it concluded with a different kind of summary. The defendant does not know the whereabouts of daughter. He stated he did not have an active part in this child's upbringing. The defendant has no knowledge of his son's whereabouts. The defendant did not partake in the rearing of this child. I thought he died in an automobile accident, his son, Rick Bellew, told me over the phone after I tracked him down in Nevada, where he was living and working as a printer. That's what my mom told me to protect me. He didn't know the truth, he said, until he was in his early 20s, when Tucker was about to be paroled. My mom was afraid he'd come up to me on the street and freak me out. He said that after his father was taken away, the authorities confiscated all their furniture and possessions, which had been paid for with stolen cash. They had to move in with his grandparents, while his mother worked in a factory to support them. He left us with nothing, he said. He turned our world inside out. After Bellew read about Tucker's last arrest, he wrote him a letter for the first time. I needed to know why he did it, he said, why he sacrificed everything. Although Tucker could never give him a satisfactory answer, they struck up a correspondence, and in one of his letters Tucker told him something he had never expected. Bellew had an older half-sister named Gail Tucker, a nurse who lived in Florida. I called her up and said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "This is your long-lost brother." She said, "Oh my God." Later, the two met, studying each other's features for similarities, trying to piece together a portrait of a man they barely knew. "I don't have any ill feelings," his daughter told me. "I just don't have any feelings." At one point, Bellew read me part of a letter that Tucker had recently sent him. "I'm sorry things turned out the way they did. I never got to take you fishing, or to baseball games, or to see you grow up. I don't ask you to forgive me as there is too much lost, but just so you know I wish you the best. Always, your dad, Forrest." Bellew said he didn't know if he would continue the correspondence, not because of what Tucker had done to him, but because of what he had done to his mother. "He blew my mother's world apart," Bellew told me. "She never remarried. There was a song she used to sing to me called Me and My Shadow, all about being alone and blue. And when she had cancer and wasn't going to live much longer, I broke down and she sang that song, and I realized how bittersweet it was. It was her life." In the spring of 2002, when I visited Tucker's third wife in Pompano Beach, she seemed to be still trying to cope. A small, delicate woman, now in her 70s, she had had several operations and lived alone in their house. "With Forrest gone, there's no one to fix things up," she said. She paused, scanning the den where he used to keep his musical instruments. The silence is unbearable. She showed me a picture of the two of them taken shortly after they met. They are standing side by side, their arms touching. He has on a red shirt and tie, and his wavy hair is neatly combed to one side. God, he used to be so handsome, she said. When I met him, he was a doll. She turned the picture of him over several times in her hand. I waited all those years, she said as she walked me outside, wiping her eyes. I thought we had the rest of our lives together. What am I supposed to do now? One of the last times I met Tucker in prison, he looked alarmingly frail. His facial muscles seemed slack and his hands trembled. Since his incarceration, he had had several strokes, and a cardiologist concluded that blood clots were gradually cutting off oxygen to his brain. His daughter told me bluntly, "He'll die in prison." "Everyone says I'm smart," Tucker said to me, "but I'm not smart in the ways of life, or I wouldn't have done the things I did." After a brief flurry of attention following his arrest, he had been all but forgotten. "When I die, no one will remember me," he said. His voice was almost a whisper. "I wish I had a real profession, something like the music business. I regret not being able to work steady and support my family. I have other regrets too, but that's as much as one man can stand." Late at night, you lie in your bunk in prison and you think about what you lost, what you were, what you could have been, and you regret. He said that his wife was thinking of selling their house and moving into a community where she could see more people. Although he and his wife still spoke regularly, Tucker said she was too frail to visit. "What hurts most is that I know how much I disappointed my wife," he went on. "That hurts more than anything." As he rose to go, he took a piece of paper from his back pocket. "I made this up for you last night," he said. On it was a list of all his escapes, neatly printed. At the bottom, there was a number 19, one more than he had actually made left blank. As the guard fetched his wheelchair, he waved him away. "I don't need my chariot," he said. Then slowly, with his back hunched, he steadied himself against the wall and, with the guard standing behind him, inched down the corridor. January 2003. True crime: a postmodern murder mystery in the southwest corner of Poland. Far from any town or city, the Oder River curls sharply, creating a tiny inlet. The banks are matted with wild grass and shrouded by towering pine and oak trees. The only people who regularly trek to the area are fishermen. The inlet teems with perch and pike and sun bass. On a cold December day in 2000, 3 friends were casting there when one of them noticed something floating by the shore. At first, he thought it was a log, but as he drew closer, he saw what looked like hair. The fisherman shouted to one of his friends, who poked the object with his rod. It was a dead body. The fisherman called the police, who carefully removed the corpse of a man from the water. A noose was around his neck, and his hands were bound behind his back. Part of the rope, which appeared to have been cut with a knife, had once connected his hands to his neck, binding the man in a backward cradle. An excruciating position. The slightest wiggle would have caused the noose to tighten further. There was no doubt that the man had been murdered. His body was clothed in only a sweatshirt and underwear, and it bore marks of torture. A pathologist determined that the victim had virtually no food in his intestines, which indicated that he had been starved for several days before he was killed. Initially, the police thought that he had been strangled and then dumped in the river, but an examination of fluids in his lungs revealed signs of drowning, which meant that he was probably still alive when he was dropped into the water. The victim, tall, with long dark hair and blue eyes, seemed to match the description of a 35-year-old businessman named Dariusz Janisiewski, who had lived in the city of Wrocław, 60 miles away, and who had been reported missing by his wife nearly 4 weeks earlier. He had last been seen on November 13th, leaving the small advertising firm that he owned in downtown Wrocław. When the police summoned Janisiewski's wife to see if she could identify the body, she was too distraught to look, and so Janisiewski's mother did instead. She immediately recognized her son's flowing hair and the birthmark on his chest. The police launched a major investigation. Scuba divers plunged into the frigid river looking for evidence. Forensic specialists combed the forest. Dozens of associates were questioned, and Janis Yuski's business records were examined. Nothing of note was found. Although Janis Yuski and his wife, who had wed 8 years earlier, had a brief period of trouble in their marriage, they had since reconciled and were about to adopt a child. He had no apparent debts or enemies and no criminal record. Witnesses described him as a gentle man, an amateur guitarist who composed music for his rock band. He was not the kind of person who would provoke fights, his wife said. He wouldn't harm anybody. After 6 months, the investigation was dropped because of an inability to find the perpetrator or perpetrators, as the prosecutor put it in his report. Janis Yuski's family hung a cross on an oak tree near where the body was found, one of the few reminders of what the Polish press dubbed the perfect crime. One afternoon in the fall of 2003, Jacek Roboluski, a 38-year-old detective in the Wrocław Police Department, unlocked the safe in his office, where he stored his files, and removed a folder marked Janis Yuski. It was getting late, and most members of the department would soon be heading home, their thick wooden doors clapping shut, one after the other, in the long stone corridor of the fortress-like building, which the Germans had built in the early 20th century, when Wrocław was still part of Germany. The building has underground tunnels leading to the jail and the courthouse, across the street. Roboluski, who preferred to work late at night, kept by his desk a coffee pot and a small refrigerator. That was about all he could squeeze into the cell-like room, which was decorated with wall-sized maps of Poland, and with calendars of scantily clad women, which he took down when he had official visitors. The Janis Yuski case was 3 years old, and had been handed over to Roboluski's unit by the local police who had conducted the original investigation. The unsolved murder was the coldest of cold cases, and Roboluski was drawn to it. He was a tall, lumbering man with a pink, fleshy face and a burgeoning paunch. He wore ordinary slacks and a shirt to work, instead of a uniform, and there was a simplicity to his appearance, which he used to his advantage. People trusted him because they thought that they had no reason to fear him. Even his superiors joked that his cases must somehow solve themselves. Jacek is Jack in English and Robel means sparrow, and so his colleagues called him Jack Sparrow, the name of the Johnny Depp character in Pirates of the Caribbean. Roboluski liked to say in response, "I'm more of an eagle." After Roboluski graduated from high school in 1984, he began searching for his purpose in life, as he put it, working variously as a municipal clerk, a locksmith, a soldier, an aircraft mechanic, and in defiance of the communist government, a union organizer allied with Solidarity. In 1994, 5 years after the communist regime collapsed, he joined the newly refashioned police force. Salaries for police officers in Poland were, and remain, dismal. A rookie earns only a few $1,000s a year, and Roboluski had a wife and 2 children to support. Still, he had finally found a position that suited him. A man with a stark Catholic vision of good and evil, he relished chasing criminals, and after putting away his first murderer, he hung a pair of goat horns on his office wall to symbolize the capture of his prey. During his few free hours, he studied psychology at a local university. He wanted to understand the criminal mind. Roboluski had heard about the murder of Janis Yuski, but he was unfamiliar with the details, and he sat down at his desk to review the file. He knew that, in cold cases, the key to solving the crime is often an overlooked clue buried in the original file. He studied the pathologist's report and the photographs of the crime scene. The level of brutality, Roboluski thought, suggested that the perpetrator or perpetrators had a deep grievance against Januszewski. Moreover, the virtual absence of clothing on Januszewski's battered body indicated that he had been stripped in an attempt to humiliate him. There was no evidence of sexual abuse. According to Januszewski's wife, her husband always carried credit cards, but they had not been used after the crime, another indication that this was no mere robbery. Roboluski read the various statements that had been given to the local police. The most revealing was from Januszewski's mother, who had worked as a bookkeeper in his advertising firm. On the day that her son disappeared, she stated, a man had called the office at around 9:30 a.m. looking for him. The caller made an urgent request. Could you make 3 signs, quite big ones, and the third one as big as a billboard? He asked. When she inquired further, he said, I will not talk to you about this, demanding again to speak to her son. She explained that he was out of the office, but she gave the caller Januszewski's cell phone number. The man hung up. He had not identified himself, and Januszewski's mother had not recognized his voice, though she thought that he sounded professional. During the conversation, she had heard noise in the background, a dull roar. Later, when her son showed up at the office, she asked him if the customer had called, and Januszewski replied that they had arranged to meet that afternoon. According to a receptionist in the building, who was the last known person to see Januszewski alive, he departed the office at around 4 o'clock. He left his car, a Peugeot, in the parking lot, which his family said was very unusual. Although he often met with customers away from the office, he habitually took his car. Investigators, upon checking phone records, discovered that the call to Januszewski's office had come from a phone booth down the street. This explained the background noise, Roboluski thought. Records also indicated that, less than a minute after the call ended, someone at the same public phone had rung Januszewski's cell phone. Though the calls were suspicious, Roboluski could not be certain that the caller was a perpetrator, just as he could not yet say how many assailants were involved in the crime. Januszewski was more than 6 feet tall and weighed some 200 pounds, and tying him up and disposing of his body may have required accomplices. The receptionist reported that when Januszewski left the office, she had seen 2 men seemingly trailing him, though she could not describe them in any detail. Whoever was behind the abduction, Roboluski thought, had been extremely organized and shrewd. The mastermind, Roboluski assumed it was a man, based on the caller's voice, must have studied Januszewski's business routine and known how to lure him out of his office and possibly into a car. Roboluski pored over the materials, trying to find something more, yet he remained stymied. After several hours, he locked the file in his safe, but over the next several days and nights he took it out again and again. At one point, he realized that Januszewski's cell phone had never been found. Roboluski decided to see if the phone could be traced, an unlikely possibility. Poland lagged behind other European countries in technological development, and its financially strapped police force was only beginning to adopt more sophisticated methods of tracking cellular and computer communications. Nevertheless, Roboluski had taken a keen interest in these new techniques, and he began an elaborate search, with the help of the department's recently hired telecommunications specialist. Although Januszewski's telephone number had not been used since his disappearance, Roboluski knew that cell phones often bear a serial number from the manufacturer, and his men contacted Januszewski's wife, who provided a receipt containing this information. To Roboluski's astonishment, he and his colleagues soon found a match. A cell phone with the same serial number had been sold on Allegro, an internet auction site, 4 days after Januszewski disappeared. The seller had logged in as Crisp, who, investigators learned, was a 30-year-old Polish intellectual named Christian Bala. It seemed inconceivable that a murderer who had orchestrated such a well-planned crime would have sold the victim's cell phone on an internet auction site. Bala, Roboluski realized, could have obtained it from someone else, or purchased it at a pawn shop, or even found it on the street. Bala had since moved abroad and could not be easily reached, but as Roboluski checked into his background, he discovered that he had recently published a novel called Amok. Roboluski obtained a copy, which had on the cover a surreal image of a goat, an ancient symbol of the devil. Like the works of the French novelist Michel Houellebecq, the book is sadistic, pornographic, and creepy. The main character, who narrates the story, is a bored, polished intellectual who, when not musing about philosophy, is drinking and having sex with women. Roboluski, who read mostly history books, was shocked by the novel's contents, which were not only decadent but vehemently anti-church. He made note of the fact that the narrator murders a female lover for no reason. What had come over me? What the hell did I do? And conceals the act so well that he is never caught. Roboluski was struck in particular by the killer's method. I tightened the noose around her neck. Roboluski then noticed something else. The killer's name is Chris, the English version of the author's first name. It was also the name that Christian Bala had posted on the internet auction site. Roboluski began to read the book more closely, a hardened cop turned literary detective. 4 years earlier, in the spring of 1999, Christian Bala sat in a cafe in Wrocław wearing a three-piece suit. He was going to be filmed for a documentary called Young Money, about the new generation of businessmen in the suddenly freewheeling Polish capitalist system. Bala, who was then 26, had been chosen for the documentary because he had started an industrial cleaning business that used advanced machinery from the United States. Though Bala had dressed up for the occasion, he looked more like a brooding poet than like a businessman. He had dark, ruminative eyes and thick, curly brown hair. Slender and sensitive-looking, he was so handsome that his friends had nicknamed him Amour. He chain-smoked and spoke like a professor of philosophy, which is what he had trained and still hoped to become. I don't feel like a businessman, Bala later told the interviewer, adding that he had always dreamed of an academic career. He had been the equivalent of high school valedictorian, and as an undergraduate at the University of Wrocław, which he attended from 1992 to 1997, he was considered one of the brightest philosophy students. The night before an exam, while other students were cramming, he often stayed out drinking and carousing, only to show up the next morning, disheveled and hung over, and score the highest marks. One time, I went out with him and nearly died taking the exam. His close friend and former classmate Lothar Rasinski, who now teaches philosophy at another university in Wrocław, recalls. Beda Siraka, who was one of Bala's philosophy professors, says that he had a voracious appetite for learning and an inquisitive, rebellious mind. Bala, who often stayed with his parents in Chajno, a provincial town outside Wrocław, began bringing home stacks of philosophy books, lining the hallways and filling the basement. Poland's philosophy departments had long been dominated by Marxism, which, like liberalism, is rooted in Enlightenment notions of reason and in the pursuit of universal truths. Bala, however, was drawn to the radical arguments of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who maintained that language, like a game of chess, is essentially a social activity. Bala often referred to Wittgenstein as my master. He also seized on Friedrich Nietzsche's notorious contention that there are no facts, only interpretations, and that truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions. For Bala, such subversive ideas made particular sense after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, where language and facts had been wildly manipulated to create a false sense of history. The end of communism marked the death of one of the great meta-narratives, Bala later told me, paraphrasing the postmodernist Jean-François Lyotard. Bala once wrote in an email to a friend, "Read Wittgenstein and Nietzsche, 20 times each." Bala's father, Stanislaw, who was a construction worker and a taxi driver, "I'm a simple, uneducated man," he says, was proud of his son's academic accomplishments. Still, he occasionally wanted to throw away Christian's books and force him to plant with me in the garden. Stanislaw sometimes worked in France, and during the summer Christian frequently went with him to earn extra money for his studies. He would bring suitcases stuffed with books, Stanislaw recalls. He would work all day and study through the night. I used to joke that he knew more about France from books than from seeing it. By then, Bala had become entranced by French postmodernists such as Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. He was particularly interested in Derrida's notion that not only is language too unstable to pinpoint any absolute truth, human identity itself is the malleable product of language. Bala wrote a thesis about Richard Rorty, the American philosopher, who famously declared, "The guise of convincing your peers is the very face of truth itself." Bala interpreted these thinkers idiosyncratically, pulling threads here and there, and often twisting and turning and distorting them, until he had braided them into his own radical philosophy. To amuse himself, he began constructing myths about himself: an adventure in Paris, a romance with a schoolmate, and tried to convince friends that they were true. He would tell these tall stories about himself, Rasinski says. If he told one person and that person then told someone else who told someone else, it became true. It existed in the language. Rasinski adds, Christian even had a term for it. He called it mythocreativity. Before long, friends had trouble distinguishing his real character from the one he had invented. In an email to a friend, Bala said, "If I ever write an autobiography, it will be full of myths." Bala cast himself as an enfant terrible who sought out what Foucault had called a limma experience. He wanted to push the boundaries of language and human existence, to break free of what he deemed to be the hypocritical and oppressive truths of Western society, including taboos on sex and drugs. Foucault himself was drawn to homosexual sadomasochism. Bala devoured the works of Georges Bataille, who vowed to brutally oppose all systems, and once contemplated carrying out human sacrifices, and William Burroughs, who swore to use language to rub out the word, and the Marquis de Sade, who demanded, "Oh man, is it for you to say what is good or what is evil?" Bala boasted about his drunken visits to brothels and his submission to temptations of the flesh. He told friends that he hated conventions and was capable of anything, and he insisted, "I will not live long, but I will live furiously." Some people found such proclamations juvenile, even ridiculous. Others were mesmerized by them. There were legends that no woman could resist him, one friend recalled. Those closest to him regarded his tales simply as playful confabulations. Siraka, his former professor, says that Bala in reality was always kind, energetic, hardworking, and principled. His friend Rasinski says, Christian liked the idea of being this Nietzschean Superman, but anyone who knew him well realized that, as with his language games, he was just playing around. In 1995, Bala, belying his libertine posture, married his high school sweetheart, Stanislawa, or Stasia, as he called her. Stasia, who had dropped out of high school and worked as a secretary, showed little interest in language or philosophy. Bala's mother opposed the marriage, believing Stasia was ill-suited for her son. "I thought he should at least wait until he had finished his studies," she says. But Bala insisted that he wanted to take care of Stasia, who had always loved him, and in 1997 their son Kakber was born. That year Bala graduated from the university with the highest possible marks and enrolled in its PhD program in philosophy. Although he received a full academic scholarship, he struggled to support his family and soon left school to open his cleaning business. In the documentary on Poland's new generation of businessmen, Bala says, Reality came and kicked me in the ass. With an air of resignation, he continues, "Once, I planned to paint graffiti on walls. Now I'm trying to wash it off." He was not a good businessman. Whenever money came in, colleagues say, instead of investing it in his company, he spent it. By 2000, he had filed for bankruptcy. His marriage also collapsed. "The basic problem was women," his wife later said. "I knew that he was having an affair." After Stasia separated from him, he seemed despondent and left Poland, traveling to the United States and later to Asia, where he taught English and scuba diving. He began to work intensively on Amok, which encapsulated all his philosophical obsessions. The story mirrors Crime and Punishment, in which Raskolnikov, convinced that he is a superior being who can deliver his own form of justice, murders a wretched pawnbroker. "Wouldn't thousands of good deeds make up for one tiny little crime?" Raskolnikov asks. If Raskolnikov is a Frankenstein's monster of modernity, then Chris, the protagonist of Amok, is a monster of postmodernity. In his view, not only is there no sacred being, God, if you only existed, you'd see how sperm looks on blood. There is also no truth. Truth is being displaced by narrative. One character admits that he doesn't know which of his constructed personalities is real, and Chris says, "I'm a good liar because I believe in the lies myself." Unbound by any sense of truth, moral, scientific, historical, biographical, legal, Chris embarks on a grisly rampage. After his wife catches him having sex with her best friend and leaves him, Chris says that he has, at least, stripped her of her illusions. He sleeps with one woman after another, the sex ranging from numbing to sadomasochistic. Inverting convention, he lusts after ugly women, insisting that they are more real, more touchable, more alive. He drinks too much. He spews vulgarities, determined, as one character puts it, to pulverize the language, to screw it like no one else has ever screwed it. He mocks traditional philosophers and blasphemes the Catholic Church. In one scene, he gets drunk with a friend and steals from a church a statue of St. Anthony, the Egyptian saint who lived secluded in the desert, battling the temptations of the devil, and who fascinated Foucault. Foucault, describing how St. Anthony had turned to the Bible to ward off the devil, only to encounter a bloody description of Jews slaughtering their enemies, writes that evil is not embodied in individuals but incorporated in words, and that even a book of salvation can open the gates to hell. Finally, Chris, repudiating what is considered the ultimate moral truth, kills his girlfriend Mary. "I tightened the noose around her neck, holding her down with one hand," he says. "With my other hand, I stabbed the knife below her left breast. Everything was covered in blood." He then ejaculates on her. In a perverse echo of Wittgenstein's notion that some actions defy language, Chris says of the killing, "There was no noise, no words, no movement. Complete silence." In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov confesses his sins and is punished for them, while being redeemed by the love of a woman named Sonia, who helps to guide him back toward a pre-modern Christian order. But Chris never removes what he calls his white gloves of silence, and he is never punished. "Murder leaves no stain," he declares. And his wife, who, not coincidentally, is also named Sonia, never returns to him. The style and structure of Amok, which is derivative of many postmodern novels, reinforces the idea that truth is illusory. What is a novel anyway but a lie, a myth, a creation? Bala's narrator often addresses the reader, reminding him that he is being seduced by a work of fiction. "I am starting my story," Chris says. "I must avoid boring you." In another typical flourish, Chris reveals that he is reading a book about the violent rebellion of a young author with a guilty conscience, in other words, the same story as Amok. Throughout the book, Bala plays with words in order to emphasize their slipperiness. The title of one chapter, Screwdriver, refers simultaneously to the tool, the cocktail, and Chris's sexual behavior. Even when Chris slaughters Mary, it feels like a language game. I pulled the knife and rope from underneath the bed, as if I were about to begin a children's fairy tale, Chris says. Then I started unwinding this fable of rope, and to make it more interesting I started to make a noose. It took me 2 million years. Bala finished the book toward the end of 2002. He had given Chris a biography similar to his own, blurring the boundary between author and narrator. He even posted sections of the book on a blog called Amok, and during discussions with readers he wrote comments under the name Chris, as if he were the character. After the book came out in 2003, an interviewer asked him, "Some authors write only to release their Mr. Hyde, the dark side of their psyche, do you agree?" Bala joked in response, "I know what you're driving at, but I won't come." It might turn out that Christian Bala is the creation of Chris, not the other way around. Few bookstores in Poland carried Amok, in part because of the novel's shocking content, and those which did placed it on the highest shelves, out of the reach of children. The book has not been translated into English. On the internet, a couple of reviewers praised Amok. "We haven't had this kind of book in Polish literature," one wrote, adding that it was paralyzingly realistic, totally vulgar, full of paranoid and delirious images. Another called it a masterpiece of illusion. Yet most readers considered the book, as one major Polish newspaper put it, to be without literary merit. Even one of Bala's friends dismissed it as rubbish. When Siraka, the philosophy professor, opened it, she was stunned by its crude language, which was the antithesis of the straightforward, intelligent style of the papers that Bala had written at the university. "Frankly, I found the book hard to read," she says. An ex-girlfriend of Bala's later said, "I was shocked by the book because he never used those words. He never acted obscenely or vulgar toward me. Our sex life was normal." Many of Bala's friends believed that he wanted to do in his fiction what he never did in life: shatter every taboo. In the interview that Bala gave after Amok was published, he said, "I wrote the book not caring about any convention. A simple reader will find interesting only a few violent scenes, with a graphic description of people having sex. But if someone really looks, he will see that these scenes are intended to awaken the reader and show how fucked up and impoverished and hypocritical this world is." By Bala's own estimate, Amok sold only a couple of thousand copies, but he was confident that it would eventually find its place among the great works of literature. "I'm truly convinced that one day my book will be appreciated," he said. "History teaches that some works of art have to wait ages before they are recognized." In at least one respect, the book succeeded. Chris was so authentically creepy that it was hard not to believe that he was the product of a genuinely disturbed mind, and that he and the author were indeed indistinguishable. On Bala's website, readers described him and his work as grotesque, sexist, and psychopathic. During an internet conversation in June of 2003, a friend told Bala that his book did not give the reader a good impression of him. When Bala assured her that the book was fiction, she insisted that Chris's musings had to be your thoughts. Bala became irritated. "Only a fool," he said, "would believe that." Detective Robleski underlined various passages as he studied Amok. At first glance, few details of Mary's murder resembled the killing of Janis Yuski. Most conspicuously, the victim in the novel is a woman, and the killer's longtime friend. Moreover, although Mary has a noose around her neck, she gets stabbed with a Japanese knife, and Janis Yuski wasn't. One detail in the book, however, chilled Robleski. After the murder, Chris says, "I sell the Japanese knife on an internet auction." The similarity to the selling of Janis Yuski's cell phone on the internet, a detail that the police had never released to the public, seemed too extraordinary to be a coincidence. At one point in Amok, Chris intimates that he has also killed a man. When one of his girlfriends doubts his endless mythocreations, he says, Which story didn't you believe, that my radio station went bankrupt or that I killed a man who behaved inappropriately toward me 10 years ago? He adds of the murder. Everyone considers it a fable. Maybe it's better that way. Fuck. Sometimes I don't believe it myself. Roboluski had never read about postmodernism or language games. For him, facts were as indissoluble as bullets. You either killed someone or you didn't. His job was to piece together a logical chain of evidence that revealed the irrefutable truth. But Roboluski also believed that, in order to catch a killer, you had to understand the social and psychological forces that had formed him. And so, if Bala had murdered Januszewski or participated in the crime as Roboluski now fully suspected, then Roboluski, the empiricist, would have to become a postmodernist. To the surprise of members of his detective squad, Roboluski made copies of the novel and handed them out. Everyone was assigned a chapter to interpret, to try to find any clues, any coded messages, any parallels with reality. Because Bala was living outside the country, Roboluski warned his colleagues not to do anything that might alarm the author. Roboluski knew that if Bala did not voluntarily return home to see his family, as he periodically did, it would be virtually impossible for the Polish police to apprehend him. At least for the moment, the police had to refrain from questioning Bala's family and friends. Instead, Roboluski and his team combed public records and interrogated Bala's more distant associates, constructing a profile of the suspect, which they then compared with the profile of Chris in the novel. Roboluski kept an unofficial scorecard. Both Bala and his literary creation were consumed by philosophy, had been abandoned by their wives, had a company go bankrupt, traveled around the world and drank too much. Roboluski discovered that Bala had once been detained by the police, and when he obtained the official report it was as if he had already read it. As Bala's friend Paul, who was detained with him, later testified in court, Christian came to me in the evening and had a bottle with him. We started drinking. Actually, we drank till dawn. Paul went on, the alcohol ran out, so we went to a store to buy another bottle. As we were returning from the shop, we passed by a church, and this is when we had a very stupid idea. What idea did you have? The judge asked him. We went into the church and we saw St. Anthony's figure and we took it. What for? The judge inquired. Well, we wanted a third person to drink with. Christian said afterward that we were crazy. In the novel, when the police catch Chris and his friend drinking beside the statue of St. Anthony, Chris says, "We were threatened by prison. I was speechless. I do not feel like a criminal, but I became one. I had done much worse things in my life and never suffered any consequences." Roboluski began to describe Amok as a road map to a crime, but some authorities objected that he was pushing the investigation in a highly suspect direction. The police asked a criminal psychologist to analyze the character of Chris in order to gain insight into Bala. The psychologist wrote in her report, "The character of Chris is an egocentric man with great intellectual ambitions. He perceives himself as an intellectual with his own philosophy, based on his education and high IQ. His way of functioning shows features of psychopathic behavior. He is testing the limits to see if he can actually carry out his sadistic fantasies. He treats people with disrespect, considers them to be intellectually inferior to himself, uses manipulation to fulfill his own needs, and is determined to satiate his sexual desires in a hedonistic way. If such a character were real, a true living person, his personality could have been shaped by a highly unrealistic sense of his own worth. It could also be a result of psychological wounds and his insecurities as a man, pathological relationships with his parents, or unacceptable homosexual tendencies. The psychologist acknowledged the links between Bala and Chris, such as divorce and philosophical interests, but cautioned that such overlaps were common with novelists. And she warned, Basing an analysis of the author on his fictional character would be a gross violation. Robleski knew that details in the novel did not qualify as evidence; they had to be corroborated independently. So far, though, he had only one piece of concrete evidence linking Bala to the victim: the cell phone. In February 2002, the Polish television program 997, which, like America's Most Wanted, solicits the public's help in solving crimes, 997 is the emergency telephone number in Poland, aired a segment devoted to Januszewski's murder. Afterward, the show posted on its website the latest news about the progress of the investigation and asked for tips. Robleski and his men carefully analyzed the responses. Over the years, hundreds of people had visited the website, from places as far away as Japan, South Korea, and the United States. Yet the police didn't turn up a single fruitful lead. When Robleski and the telecommunications expert checked to see if Bala had purchased or sold any other items on the internet while logged on as Crisp, they made a curious discovery. On October 17, 2000, a month before Januszewski was kidnapped, Bala had clicked on the Allegro auction site for a police manual called Accidental, Suicidal, or Criminal Hanging. Hanging a mature, conscious, healthy, and physically fit person is very difficult even for several people, the manual stated, and described various ways that a noose might be tied. Bala did not purchase the book on Allegro, and it was unclear if he obtained it elsewhere, but the fact that he was seeking such information was, at least to Robleski, a sign of premeditation. Still, Robleski knew that if he wanted to convict Bala of murder, he would need more than the circumstantial evidence he had gathered. He would need a confession. Bala remained abroad, supporting himself by publishing articles in travel magazines and by teaching English and scuba diving. In January of 2005, while visiting Micronesia, he sent an email to a friend saying, "I'm writing this letter from paradise." Finally, that fall, Robleski learned that Bala was coming home. At approximately 2:30 p.m., after leaving a drugstore at Legnica Street in Chojno, I was attacked by 3 men, Bala later wrote in a statement, describing what happened to him on September 5, 2005, shortly after he returned to his hometown. One of them twisted my arms behind my back. Another squeezed my throat so that I could not speak and could barely breathe. Meanwhile, the third one handcuffed me. Bala said that his attackers were tall and muscular, with close-cropped hair like skinheads. Without telling Bala who they were or what they wanted, they forced him into a dark green vehicle and slipped a black plastic bag over his head. I couldn't see anything, Bala said. They ordered me to lie face down on the floor. Bala said that his assailants continued to beat him, shouting, "You fucking prick, you motherfucker." He pleaded with them to leave him alone and not hurt him. Then he heard one of the men say on a cell phone, "Hi, boss, we got the shithead. Yes, he's still alive. So now what?" At the meeting point, the man continued, "And what about the money? Will we get it today?" Bala said he thought that, because he lived abroad and was known to be a writer, the men assumed that he was wealthy and were seeking a ransom. "I tried to explain to them that I didn't have money," Bala stated. The more he spoke, though, the more brutally they attacked him. Eventually, the car came to a stop, apparently in a wooded area. "We can dig a hole for this shit here and bury him," one of the men said. Bala struggled to breathe through the plastic bag. "I thought that this was going to be the last moment of my life, but suddenly they got back into the car and began driving again," he said. After a long time, the car came to another stop, and the men shoved him out of the car and into a building. "I didn't hear a door, but because there was no wind or sun, I assumed that we had entered," Bala said. The men threatened to kill him if he didn't cooperate, then led him upstairs into a small room where they stripped him, deprived him of food, beat him, and began to interrogate him. Only then, Bala said, Did he realize that he was in police custody and had been brought in for questioning by a man called Jack Sparrow? None of it happened, Robluski later told me. We used standard procedures and followed the letter of the law. According to Robluski and other officers, they apprehended Bala by the drugstore without violence and drove him to police headquarters in Wrocław. Robluski and Bala sat facing each other in the detective's cramped office. A light bulb overhead cast a faint glow, and Bala could see on the wall the goat horns that eerily resembled the image on the cover of his book. Bala appeared gentle and scholarly, yet Robluski recalled how, in a muck, Chris says, it's easier for people to imagine that Christ can turn urine into beer than that someone like me can send to hell some asshole smashed into a lump of ground meat. Robluski initially circled around the subject of the murder, trying to elicit offhand information about Bala's business and his relationships, and concealing what the police already knew about the crime, an interrogator's chief advantage. When Robluski did confront him about the killing, Bala looked dumbfounded. "I didn't know Dariusz Januszewski," he said. "I know nothing about the murder." Robluski pressed him about the curious details in a muck. Bala later told me, "It was insane. He treated the book as if it were my literal autobiography. He must have read the book 100 times. He knew it by heart." When Robluski mentioned several facts in the novel, such as the theft of the statue of St. Anthony, Bala acknowledged that he had drawn certain elements from his life. As Bala put it to me, "Sure, I'm guilty of that. Show me an author who doesn't do that." Robluski then played his trump card, the cell phone. How did Bala get hold of it? Bala said that he couldn't remember, it was 5 years ago. Then he said that he must have bought the phone at a pawn shop, as he had done several times in the past. He agreed to take a polygraph test. Robluski helped to prepare the questions for the examiner, who asked, "Just before Dariusz Januszewski lost his life, did you know this would happen? Were you the one who killed him? Do you know who actually murdered him? Did you know Januszewski? Were you in the place where Januszewski was held hostage?" Bala replied no to each question. Periodically, he seemed to slow his breathing, in the manner of a scuba diver. The examiner wondered if he was trying to manipulate the test. On some questions, the examiner suspected Bala of lying, but overall, the results were inconclusive. In Poland, after a suspect is detained for 48 hours, the prosecutor in the case is required to present his evidence before a judge and charge the suspect. Otherwise, the police must release him. The case against Bala remained weak. All Robluski and the police had was the cell phone, which Bala could have obtained, as he claimed, from a pawn shop, the sketchy results of a polygraph, a notoriously unreliable test, a book on hanging that Bala might not even have purchased, and clues possibly embedded in a novel. Robluski had no motive or confession. As a result, the authorities charged Bala only with selling stolen property, Januszewski's phone, and with paying a bribe in an unrelated business matter, which Robluski had uncovered during the course of his investigation. Robluski knew that neither charge would likely carry any jail time, and although Bala had to remain in the country and relinquish his passport, he was otherwise a free man. "I had spent 2 years trying to build a case, and I was watching it all collapse," Robluski recalled. Later, as he was flipping through Bala's passport, Robluski noticed stamps from Japan, South Korea, and the United States. He remembered that the website of the television show, 997, had recorded page views from all of those countries, a fact that had baffled investigators. Why would anyone so far away be interested in a local Polish murder? Robluski compared the periods when Bala was in each country with the timing of the page views. The dates matched. Bala, meanwhile, was becoming a cause célèbre. As Robluski continued to investigate him for murder, Bala filed a formal grievance with the authorities, claiming that he had been kidnapped and tortured. When Bala told his friend Rasinski that he was being persecuted for his art, Rasinski was incredulous. "I figured that he was testing out some crazy idea for his next novel," he recalls. Soon after, Roboluski questioned Rasinski about his friend. "That's when I realized that Christian was telling the truth," Rasinski says. Rasinski was shocked when Roboluski began to grill him about Amok. "I told him that I recognized some details from real life, but that to me the book was a work of fiction," Rasinski says. "This was crazy. You cannot prosecute a man based on the novel he wrote." Beta Siraka, Bala's former professor, who was also called in for questioning, says that she felt as if she were being interrogated by literary theorists. As outrage over the investigation mounted, one of Bala's girlfriends, Denise Reinhardt, set up a defense committee on his behalf. Reinhardt, an American theater director, met Bala while she was studying in Poland in 2001, and they had subsequently traveled together to the United States and South Korea. Reinhardt solicited support over the internet, writing, "Christian is the author of a fictional philosophical book called Amok. A lot of the language and content is strong, and there are several metaphors that might be considered against the Catholic Church and Polish tradition." During his brutal interrogation, they referenced his book numerous times, citing it as proof of his guilt. Dubbing the case the Sprawa absurd matter, the committee contacted human rights organizations and International PEN. Before long, the Polish Justice Ministry was deluged with letters on Bala's behalf from around the world. One said, "Mr. Bala deserves his rights in accordance with Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights that guarantees the right to freedom of expression. We urge you to ensure there is an immediate and thorough investigation into his kidnapping and imprisonment, and that all of those found responsible are brought to justice." Bala, writing in imperfect English, sent out frantic bulletins to the Defense Committee, which published them in a newsletter. In a bulletin on September 13, 2005, Bala warned that he was being spied on and said, "I want you to know that I will fight until the end." The next day, he said of Roboluski and the police, "They have ruined my family life. We will never talk loud at home again. We will never use internet freely again. We will never make any phone calls not thinking about who is listening. My mother takes some pills to stay calm. Otherwise she would get insane because of this absurd accusation. My old father smokes 50 cigs a day and I smoke 3 packs. We all sleep 3-4 hours daily and we are afraid of leaving a house. Every single bark of our little dog alerts us and we don't know what or who to expect. It's a terror, quiet terror." The Polish authorities, meanwhile, had launched an internal investigation into Bala's allegations of mistreatment. In early 2006, after months of probing, the investigators declared that they had found no corroborating evidence. In this instance, they insisted Bala's tale was indeed a mythocreation. "I have infected you," Chris warns the reader at the beginning of Amok. "You will not be able to get free of me." Roboluski remained haunted by one riddle in the novel, which he believed was crucial to solving the case. A character asks Chris, "Who was the one-eyed man among the blind?" The phrase derives from Erasmus, 1469–1536, the Dutch theologian and classical scholar who said, "In the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Who in Amok, Roboluski wondered, was the one-eyed man, and who were the blind men? In the novel's last line, Chris suddenly claims that he has solved the riddle, explaining, "This was the one killed by blind jealousy." But the sentence, with its strange lack of context, made little sense. One hypothesis based on Amok was that Bala had murdered Januszewski after beginning a homosexual affair with him. In the novel, after Chris's closest friend confesses that he is gay, Chris says that part of him wanted to strangle him with a rope and chop a hole in a frozen river and dump him there. Still, the theory seemed dubious. Roboluski had thoroughly investigated Januszewski's background, and there was no indication that he was gay. Another theory was that the murder was the culmination of Bala's twisted philosophy, that he was a postmodern version of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, the two brilliant Chicago students who, in the 1920s, were so entranced by Nietzsche's ideas that they killed a 14-year-old boy to see if they could execute the perfect murder and become supermen. At their trial, in which they received life sentences, Clarence Darrow, the legendary defense attorney who represented them, said of Leopold, "Here is a boy at 16 or 17 becoming obsessed with these doctrines. It was not a casual bit of philosophy with him. It was his life." Darrow, trying to save the boys from the death penalty, concluded, "Is there any blame attached because somebody took Nietzsche's philosophy seriously and fashioned his life upon it? It is hardly fair to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university." In Amok, Chris clearly aspires to be a postmodern Ubermensch, speaking of his will to power, and insisting that anyone who is unable to kill should not stay alive. Yet these sentiments did not fully explain the murder of the unknown man in the novel, who, Chris says, had behaved inappropriately toward him. Chris, alluding to what happened between them, says teasingly, "Maybe he didn't do anything significant, but the most vicious devil is in the details." If Bala's philosophy had justified, in his mind, a break from moral constraints, including the prohibition on murder, these passages suggested that there was still another motive, a deep personal connection to the victim, something that the brutality of the crime also indicated. With Bala unable to leave Poland, Robleski and his team began to question the suspect's closest friends and family. Many of those interrogated saw Bala positively, a bright, interesting man. One of his former girlfriends said of him, "Bala had recently received a reference from a past employer at an English instruction school in Poland, which described him as intelligent, inquisitive, and easy to get along with, and praised his keen sense of humor." The reference concluded, "With no reservation, I highly recommend Christian Bala for any teaching position with children." Yet, as Robleski and his men deepened their search for the devil in the details, a darker picture of Bala's life began to emerge. The years 1999 and 2000, during which time his business and his marriage collapsed and Januszewski was murdered, had been especially troubled. A friend recalled that Bala once started to behave vulgarly and wanted to take his clothes off and show his manliness. The family babysitter described him as increasingly drunk and out of control. She said he constantly berated his wife, Stasia, shouting at her that she slept around and cheated on him. According to several people, after Bala and his wife separated in 2000, he remained possessive of her. A friend who called Bala an authoritarian type said of him, "He continuously controlled Stasia and checked her phones." At a New Year's Eve party in 2000, just weeks after Januszewski's body was found, Bala thought a bartender was making advances toward his wife and, as one witness put it, went crazy. Bala screamed that he would take care of the bartender and that he had already dealt with such a guy. At the time, Stasia and her friends had dismissed his drunken outburst. Even so, it took 5 people to restrain Bala. As one of them told police, he was running amok. As Robleski and his men were trying to fix on a motive, other members of the squad stepped up their efforts to trace the 2 suspicious telephone calls that had been made to Januszewski's office and to his cell phone on the day he disappeared. The public telephone from which both calls were made was operated with a card. Each card was embedded with a unique number that registered with the phone company whenever it was used. Not long after Bala was released, the telecommunications expert on the Januszewski case was able to determine the number on the caller's card. Once the police had that information, officials could trace all the telephone numbers dialed with that same card. Over a 3-month period, 32 calls had been made. They included calls to Bala's parents, his girlfriend, his friends, and a business associate. The truth was becoming clearer and clearer, Roboluski said. Roboluski and his team soon uncovered another connection between the victim and the suspect. Malgorzata Drozdzel, a friend of Stasia's, told the police that in the summer of 2000 she had gone with Stasia to a nightclub called Crazy Horse in Rocklo. While Drozdzel was dancing, she saw Stasia talking to a man with long hair and bright blue eyes. She recognized him from around town. His name was Darius Januszewski. Roboluski had one last person to question, Stasia, but she had steadfastly refused to cooperate. Perhaps she was afraid of her ex-husband. Perhaps she believed Bala's claim that he was being persecuted by the police. Or perhaps she dreaded the idea of one day telling her son that she had betrayed his father. Roboluski and his men approached Stasia again, this time showing her sections of Amok, which was published after she and Bala had split up, and which she had never looked at closely. According to Polish authorities, Stasia examined passages involving Chris's wife, Sonia, and was so disturbed by the character's similarities to her that she finally agreed to talk. She confirmed that she had met Januszewski at Crazy Horse. I had ordered French fries, and I asked a man next to the bar whether the French fries were ready, Stasia recalled. That man was Darius. They spent the entire night talking, she said, and Januszewski gave her his phone number. Later, they went on a date and checked into a motel. But before anything happened, she said, Januszewski admitted that he was married and she left. Since I know what it's like to be a wife whose husband betrays her, I didn't want to do that to another woman, Stasia said. The difficulties in Januszewski's marriage soon ended, and he and Stasia never went out together again. Several weeks after her date with Januszewski, Stasia said, Bala showed up at her place in a drunken fury, demanding that she admit to having an affair with Januszewski. He broke down the front door and struck her. He shouted that he had hired a private detective and knew everything. He also mentioned that he had visited Darius's office and described it to me, Stasia recalled. Then he said he knew which hotel we went to and what room we were in. Later, when she learned that Januszewski had disappeared, Stasia said she asked Bala if he had anything to do with it, and he said no. She did not pursue the matter, believing that Bala, for all his tumultuous behavior, was incapable of murder. For the first time, Roboluski thought he understood the last line of Amok. This was the one killed by blind jealousy. Spectators flooded into the courtroom in Rocklaw on February 22, 2007, the first day of Bala's trial. There were philosophers who argued with each other over the consequences of postmodernism, young lawyers who wanted to learn about the police department's new investigative techniques, and reporters who chronicled every tantalizing detail. Killing doesn't make much of an impression in the 21st century, but allegedly killing and then writing about it in a novel is front-page news. A front-page article in Angora, a weekly based in Lodz, declared. The judge, Lydia Hojenska, sat at the head of the courtroom beneath an emblem of the white Polish eagle. In accordance with Polish law, the presiding judge, along with another judge and 3 citizens, acted as the jury. The defense and the prosecution sat at 2 unadorned wooden tables. Next to the prosecutors were Januszewski's widow and his parents, his mother holding a picture of her son. The public congregated in the back of the room, and in the last row was a stout, nervous woman with short red hair, who looked as if her own life were at stake. It was Bala's mother, Teresa. His father was too distraught to attend. Everyone's attention, it seemed, was directed toward a zoo-like cage near the center of the courtroom. It was almost 9 feet high and 20 feet long and had thick metal bars. Standing in the middle of it, wearing a suit and peering out calmly through his spectacles, was Christian Bala. He faced up to 25 years in prison. A trial is predicated on the idea that truth is obtainable. Yet it is also, as the writer Janet Malcolm has noted, a struggle between two competing narratives, and the story that can best withstand the attrition of the rules of evidence is the story that wins. In this case, the prosecution's narrative resembled that of Amok. Bala, like his alter ego Chris, was a depraved hedonist who, unbound by any sense of moral compunction, had murdered someone in a fit of jealous rage. The prosecution introduced files from Bala's computer, which Robberies and the police had seized during a raid of his parents' house. In one file, which had to be accessed with the password Amok, Bala cataloged, in graphic detail, sexual encounters with more than 70 women. The list included his wife, Stasia, a divorced cousin who was older and plump, the mother of a friend described as old-ass hardcore action, and a Russian whore in an old car. The prosecution also presented emails in which Bala sounded unmistakably like Chris, using the same vulgar or arcane words, such as joy juices and Madame Melancholy. In an angry email to Stasia, Bala wrote, "Life is not only screwing, darling," which echoed Chris's exclamation, "Fucking is not the end of the world, Mary." A psychologist testified that every author puts some part of his personality into his artistic creation, and that Chris and the defendant shared sadistic qualities. During all this, Bala sat in the cage, taking notes on the proceedings or looking curiously out at the crowd. At times, he seemed to call into question the premise that the truth can be discerned. Under Polish law, the defendant can ask questions directly of the witnesses, and Bala eagerly did so, his professorial inquiries often phrased to reveal the Derridian instability of their testimony. When a former girlfriend testified that Bala once went out on her balcony drunk and acted as if he were on the verge of committing suicide, he asked her if her words might have multiple interpretations. "Could we just say that this is a matter of semantics, a misuse of the word suicide?" he said. But as the trial wore on and the evidence mounted against him, the postmodernist sounded increasingly like an empiricist, a man desperately looking to show gaps in the prosecution's chain of evidence. Bala noted that no one had seen him kidnap Januszewski, or kill him, or dump his body. "I'd like to say that I never met Darius, and there is not a single witness who would confirm that I did so," Bala said. He complained that the prosecution was taking random incidents in his personal life and weaving them into a story that no longer resembled reality. The prosecutors were constructing a mythocreation, or as Bala's defense attorney put it to me, the plot of a novel. According to the defense, the police and the media had been seduced by the most alluring story rather than by the truth. Stories about the case had appeared under headlines such as "Truth Stranger Than Fiction" and "Murder," he wrote. Bala had long subscribed to the postmodernist notion of the death of the author, that an author has no more access to the meaning of his literary work than anyone else. Yet as the prosecution presented to the jury potentially incriminating details from Amok, Bala complained that his novel was being misinterpreted. He insisted that the murder of Mary was simply a symbol of the destruction of philosophy, and he made one last attempt to assert authorial control. As he later put it to me, "I'm the fucking author. I know what I meant." In early September, the case went to the jury. Bala never took the stand, but in a statement he said, "I do believe the court will make the right decision and absolve me of all the charges." Robberies, who had been promoted to inspector, showed up in court, hoping to hear the verdict. "Even when you're sure of the facts, you wonder if someone else will see them the same way you do," he told me. At last, the judges and jurors filed back into the courtroom. Bala's mother waited anxiously. She had never read Amok, which contains a scene of Chris fantasizing about raping his mother. "I started to read the book, but it was too hard," she told me. "If someone else had written the book, maybe I would have read it, but I'm his mother." Bala's father appeared in the courtroom for the first time. He had read the novel, and though he had trouble understanding parts of it, he thought it was an important work of literature. "You can read it 10, 20 times and each time discover something new in it," he said. On his copy, Bala had written an inscription to both his parents. It said, "Thank you for your forgiveness of all my sins." As Judge Hojenska read the verdict, Bala stood perfectly straight and still. Then came the one unmistakable word: guilty. The gray cinderblock prison in Wrocław looks like a relic of the Soviet era. After I slipped my visitors past through a tiny hole in the wall, a disembodied voice ordered me to the front of the building, where a solid gate swung open and a guard emerged, blinking in the sunlight. The guard waved me inside as the gate slammed shut behind us. After being searched, I was led through several dank interlocking chambers and into a small visitors' room with dingy wooden tables and chairs. Conditions in Polish prisons are notorious. Because of overcrowding, as many as 7 people are often kept in a single cell. In 2004, prison inmates in Wrocław staged a 3-day hunger strike to protest overcrowding, poor food, and insufficient medical care. Violence is also a problem. Only a few days before I arrived, I was told a visitor had been stabbed to death by an inmate. In the corner of the visitor's room was a slender, handsome man with wire-rimmed glasses and a navy blue artist's smock over a t-shirt that said University of Wisconsin. He was holding a book and looked like an American student abroad, and it took me a moment to realize that I was staring at Christian Bala. "I'm glad you could come," he said as he shook my hand, leading me to one of the tables. "This whole thing is farce, like something out of Kafka." He spoke clear English but with a heavy accent so that his E's sounded like Z's. Sitting down, he leaned across the table and I could see that his cheeks were drawn. He had dark circles around his eyes and his curly hair was standing up in front, as if he had been anxiously running his fingers through it. "I am being sentenced to prison for 25 years for writing a book," he said. "It is ridiculous. It is bullshit. Excuse my language, but that is what it is. Look, I wrote a novel, a crazy novel. Is the book vulgar? Yes. Is it obscene? Yes. Is it bawdy? Yes. Is it offensive? Yes. I intended it to be. This was a work of provocation." He paused, searching for an example, then added, "I wrote, for instance, that it would be easier for Christ to come out of a woman's womb than for me." He stopped, catching himself. "I mean for the narrator to fuck her. You see, this is supposed to offend." He went on, "What is happening to me is like what happened to Salman Rushdie." As he spoke, he placed the book that he was carrying on the table. It was a worn, battered copy of Amok. When I asked Bala about the evidence against him, such as the cell phone and the calling card, he sounded evasive and at times conspiratorial. "The calling card is not mine," he said. "Someone is trying to set me up. I don't know who yet, but someone is out to destroy me." His hand touched mine. "Don't you see what they are doing? They are constructing this reality and forcing me to live inside it." He said that he had filed an appeal, which cited logical and factual inconsistencies in the trial. For instance, one medical examiner said that Januszewski had drowned, whereas another insisted that he had died of strangulation. The judge herself had admitted that she was not sure if Bala had carried out the crime alone or with an accomplice. When I asked him about Amok, Bala became animated and gave direct and detailed answers. "The thesis of the book is not my personal thesis," he said. "I'm not an anti-feminist. I'm not a chauvinist. I'm not heartless. Chris, in many places, is my anti-hero." Several times he pointed to my pad and said, "Put this down," or "This is important." As he watched me taking notes, he said, with a hint of awe, "You see how crazy this is? You are here writing a story about a story I made up about a murder that never happened." On virtually every page of his copy of Amok, he had underlined passages and scribbled notations in the margins. Later, He showed me several scraps of paper on which he had drawn elaborate diagrams revealing his literary influences. It was clear that, in prison, he had become even more consumed by the book. "I sometimes read pages aloud to my cellmates," he said. One question that was never answered at the trial still hovered over the case. Why would someone commit a murder and then write about it in a novel that would help to get him caught? In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov speculates that even the smartest criminal makes mistakes, because he experiences at the moment of the crime a sort of failure of will and reason, which are replaced by a phenomenal, childish thoughtlessness, just at the moment when reason and prudence are most necessary. Amok, however, had been published 3 years after the murder. If Bala was guilty of murder, the cause was not a failure of will and reason, but rather an excess of both. Some observers wondered if Bala had wanted to get caught, or at least to unburden himself. In Amok, Chris speaks of having a guilty conscience and of his desire to remove his white gloves of silence. Though Bala maintained his innocence, it was possible to read the novel as a kind of confession. Robleski and the authorities, who believed that Bala's greatest desire was to attain literary immortality, saw his crime and his writing as indivisible. At the trial, Janisiuska's widow pleaded with the press to stop making Bala out to be an artist rather than a murderer. Since his arrest, Amok had become a sensation in Poland, selling out at virtually every bookstore. "There's going to be a new edition coming out with an afterword about the trial and all the events that have happened," Bala told me excitedly. "Other countries are interested in publishing it as well." Flipping through the pages of his own copy, he added, "There's never been a book quite like this." As we spoke, he seemed far less interested in the idea of the perfect crime than he was in the perfect story, which, in his definition, pushed past the boundaries of aesthetics and reality and morality charted by his literary forebears. "You know, I'm working on a sequel to Amok," he said, his eyes lighting up. "It's called De Lyric." He repeated the word several times. It's a pun. It means lyrics, as in a story, or delirium. He explained that he had started the new book before he was arrested, but that the police had seized his computer, which contained his only copy. He was trying to get the files back. "The authorities told me that they had found in the computer evidence that Bala was collecting information on Stasha's new boyfriend, Harry. Single, 34 years old, his mom died when he was 8, Bala had written. Apparently works at the railway company, probably as a train driver, but I'm not sure." Robleski and the authorities suspected that Harry might be Bala's next target. After Bala had learned that Harry visited an internet chat room, he had posted a message at the site, under an assumed name, saying, "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for Harry. Does anyone know him from Chajno?" Bala told me that he hoped to complete his second novel after the appeals court made its ruling. In fact, several weeks after we spoke, the court, to the disbelief of many, annulled the original verdict. Although the appeals panel found an undoubted connection between Bala and the murder, it concluded that there were still gaps in the logical chain of evidence, such as the medical examiner's conflicting testimony, which needed to be resolved. The panel refused to release Bala from prison, but ordered a new trial. Bala insisted that, no matter what happened, he would finish De Lyric. He glanced at the guards as if afraid they might hear him, then leaned forward and whispered, "This book is going to be even more shocking." February 2008. In December of 2008, Bala received a new trial. Once more he was found guilty. He is currently serving a 25-year sentence. The Chameleon, The Many Lives of Frédéric Bourdin on May 3, 2005 in France. A man called an emergency hotline for missing and exploited children. He frantically explained that he was a tourist passing through Orthez, near the Western Pyrenees, and that at the train station he had encountered a 15-year-old boy who was alone and terrified. Another hotline received a similar call. and the boy eventually arrived by himself at a local government child welfare office. Slender and short, with pale skin and trembling hands, he wore a muffler around much of his face and had a baseball cap pulled over his eyes. He had no money and carried little more than a cell phone and an ID, which said that his name was Francisco Hernandez Fernandez, and that he was born on December 13, 1989 in Cáceres, Spain. Initially, he barely spoke, but after some prodding he revealed that his parents and younger brother had been killed in a car accident. The crash left him in a coma for several weeks, and upon recovering, he was sent to live with an uncle, who abused him. Finally, he fled to France, where his mother had grown up. French authorities placed Francisco at the St. Vincent de Paul shelter in the nearby city of Pau, a stater-run institution that housed about 35 boys and girls, most of whom had been either removed from dysfunctional families or abandoned. The shelter was in an old stone building with peeling white wooden shutters. On the roof was a statue of St. Vincent protecting a child in the folds of his gown. Francisco was given a single room, and he seemed relieved to be able to wash and change in private. His head and body, he explained, were covered in burns and scars from the car accident. He was enrolled at the College Jean Monnet, a local secondary school that had 400 or so students, mostly from tough neighborhoods, and that had a reputation for violence. Although students were forbidden to wear hats, the principal at the time, Claire Chattern, made an exception for Francisco, who said that he feared being teased about his scars. Like many of the social workers and teachers who dealt with Francisco, Chattern, who had been an educator for more than 30 years, felt protective toward him. With his baggy pants and his cell phone dangling from a cord around his neck, he looked like a typical teenager, but he seemed deeply traumatized. He never changed his clothes in front of the other students in gym class and resisted being subjected to a medical exam. He spoke softly, with his head bowed, and recoiled if anyone tried to touch him. Gradually, Francisco began hanging out with other kids at recess and participating in class. Since he had enrolled so late in the school year, his literature teacher asked another student, Rafael Pessoa de Almeida, to help him with his coursework. Before long, Francisco was helping Rafael. "This guy can learn like lightning," Rafael recalls thinking. One day after school, Rafael asked Francisco if he wanted to go ice skating, and the two became friends, playing video games and sharing school gossip. Rafael sometimes picked on his younger brother, and Francisco, recalling that he used to mistreat his own sibling, advised, "Make sure you love your brother and stay close." At one point, Rafael borrowed Francisco's cell phone. To his surprise, its address book and call log were protected by security codes. When Rafael returned the phone, Francisco displayed a photograph on its screen of a young boy who looked just like Francisco. "That's my brother," he said. Francisco was soon one of the most popular kids in school, dazzling classmates with his knowledge of music and arcane slang. He even knew American idioms, and moving effortlessly between rival cliques. The students loved him, a teacher recalls. He had this aura about him, this charisma. During tryouts for a talent show, the music teacher asked Francisco if he was interested in performing. He handed her a CD to play, then walked to the end of the room and tilted his hat flamboyantly, waiting for the music to start. As Michael Jackson's song Unbreakable filled the room, Francisco started to dance like the pop star, twisting his limbs and lip-syncing the words, "You can't believe it, you can't conceive it, and you can't touch me 'cause I'm untouchable." Everyone in the room watched in awe. He didn't just look like Michael Jackson, the music teacher subsequently recalled. He was Michael Jackson. Later in computer class, Francisco showed Rafael an internet image of a small reptile with a slithery tongue. "What is it?" Rafael asked. "A chameleon," Francisco replied. On June 8th, an administrator rushed into the principal's office. She said that she had been watching a television program the other night about one of the world's most infamous imposters, Frédéric Bourdin, a 30-year-old Frenchman who serially impersonated children. "I swear to God, Bourdin looks exactly like Francisco Hernandez Fernandez," the administrator said. Chattern was incredulous. 30 would make Francisco older than some of her teachers. She did a quick internet search for Frédéric Bourdin. Hundreds of news items came up about the king of imposters and the master of new identities, who, like Peter Pan, didn't want to grow up. A photograph of Bourdin closely resembled Francisco. There was the same formidable chin, the same gap between the front teeth. Chattern called the police. "Are you sure it's him?" an officer asked. "No, but I have this strange feeling." When the police arrived, Chattern sent the assistant principal to summon Francisco from class. As Francisco entered Chattern's office, the police seized him and thrust him against the wall, causing her to panic. What if he really was an abused orphan? Then, while handcuffing Bourdin, the police removed his baseball cap. There were no scars on his head. Rather, he was going bald. "I want a lawyer," he said, his voice suddenly dropping to that of a man. At police headquarters, he admitted that he was Frédéric Bourdin, and that in the past decade and a half he had invented scores of identities in more than 15 countries and 5 languages. His aliases included Benjamin Kent, Jimmy Morans, Alex Dole, Slajan Raskovic, Arnaud Arians, Giovanni Petrullo, and Michelangelo Martini. News reports claimed that he had even impersonated a tiger tamer and a priest, but in truth, he had nearly always played a similar character, an abused or abandoned child. He was unusually adept at transforming his appearance, his facial hair, his weight, his walk, his mannerisms. "I can become whatever I want," he liked to say. In 2004, when he pretended to be a 14-year-old French boy in the town of Grenoble, a doctor who examined him at the request of authorities concluded that he was indeed a teenager. A police captain in Pau noted, "When he talked in Spanish, he became a Spaniard. When he talked in English, he was an Englishman." Chattern said of him, "Of course he lied, but what an actor." Over the years, Bourdin had insinuated himself into youth shelters, orphanages, foster homes, junior high schools, and children's hospitals. His trail of cons extended to, among other places, Spain, Germany, Belgium, England, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Bosnia, Portugal, Austria, Slovakia, France, Sweden, Denmark, and America. The U.S. State Department warned that he was an exceedingly clever man who posed as a desperate child in order to win sympathy, and a French prosecutor called him an incredible illusionist whose perversity is matched only by his intelligence. Bourdin himself has said, "I am a manipulator. My job is to manipulate." In Pau, the authorities launched an investigation to determine why a 30-year-old man would pose as a teenage orphan. They found no evidence of sexual deviance or pedophilia. They did not uncover any financial motive either. "In my 22 years on the job, I've never seen a case like it," Eric Morrell, the prosecutor, told me. "Usually people con for money. His profit seems to have been purely emotional." On his right forearm, police discovered a tattoo. It said "Chameleon Nantes, chameleon from Nantes." "Mr. Grann," Bourdin said, politely extending his hand to me. We were on a street in the center of Pau, where he had agreed to meet me one morning in the fall of 2007. For once, he seemed unmistakably an adult, with a faint 5 o'clock shadow. He was dressed theatrically in white pants, a white shirt, a checkered vest, white shoes, a blue satin bow tie, and a foppish hat. Only the gap between his teeth evoked the memory of Francisco Hernandez Fernandez. After his ruse in Pau had been exposed, Bourdin moved to a village in the Pyrenees, 25 miles away. "I wanted to escape from all the glare," he said. As had often been the case with Bourdin's deceptions, the authorities were not sure how to punish him. Psychiatrists determined that he was sane. "Is he a psychopath?" one doctor testified. "Absolutely not. No statute seemed to fit his crime." Ultimately, he was charged with obtaining and using a fake ID and received a 6-month suspended sentence. A local reporter, Xavier Soda, told me that since then Burden had periodically appeared in POW, always in a different guise. Sometimes he had a mustache or a beard. Sometimes his hair was tightly cropped. At other times it was straggly. Sometimes he dressed like a rapper, and on other occasions like a businessman. It was as if he were trying to find a new character to inhabit, Soda said. Burden and I sat down on a bench near the train station as a light rain began to fall. A car paused by the curb in front of us with a couple inside. They rolled down the window, peered out, and said to each other, "Le Caméléon." "I am quite famous in France these days," Burden said. "Too famous." As we spoke, his large brown eyes flitted across me, seemingly taking me in. One of his police interrogators called him a human recorder. To my surprise, Burden knew where I had worked, where I was born, the name of my wife, even what my sister and brother did for a living. "I like to know whom I'm meeting," he said. Aware of how easy it is to deceive others, he was paranoid of being a mark. "I don't trust anybody," he said. For a person who described himself as a professional liar, he seemed oddly fastidious about the facts of his own life. "I don't want you to make me into somebody I'm not," he said. "The story is good enough without embellishment." I knew that Burden had grown up in and around Nantes, and I asked him about his tattoo. Why would someone who tried to erase his identity leave a trace of one? He rubbed his arm where the words were imprinted on his skin. Then he said, "I will tell you the truth behind all my lies." Before he was Benjamin Kent or Michelangelo Martini, before he was the child of an English judge or an Italian diplomat, he was Frédéric Pierre Burden, the illegitimate son of Ghislaine Burden, who was 18 and poor when she gave birth to him, in a suburb of Paris, on June 13, 1974. On government forms, Frédéric's father is often listed as X, meaning that his identity was unknown. But Ghislaine, during an interview at her small house in a rural area in western France, told me that X was a 25-year-old Algerian immigrant named Cassie, whom she had met at a margarine factory where they both worked. She says that she can no longer remember his last name. After she became pregnant, she discovered that Cassie was already married, and so she left her job and did not tell him that she was carrying his child. Ghislaine raised Frédéric until he was 2.5. He was like any other child, totally normal, she says, at which time child services intervened at the behest of her parents. A relative says of Ghislaine, "She liked to drink and dance and stay out at night. She didn't want anything to do with that child." Ghislaine insists that she had obtained another factory job and was perfectly competent, but the judge placed Frédéric in her parents' custody. Years later, Ghislaine wrote Frédéric a letter, telling him, "You are my son and they stole you from me at the age of 2. They did everything to separate us from each other and we have become two strangers." Frédéric says that his mother had a dire need for attention, and on the rare occasions that he saw her, she would feign being deathly ill and make him run to get help. "To see me frightened gave her pleasure," he says. Though Ghislaine denies this, she acknowledges that she once attempted suicide and her son had to rush to find assistance. When Frédéric was 5, he moved with his grandparents to Mauchamps, a hamlet southeast of Nantes. Frédéric, part Algerian and fatherless, and dressed in second-hand clothes from Catholic charities, was a village outcast, and in school he began to tell fabulous stories about himself. He said that his father was never around because he was a British secret agent. One of his elementary school teachers, Yvonne Burgill, describes Burden as a precocious and captivating child who had an extraordinary imagination and visual sense, drawing wild, beautiful comic strips. "He had this way of making you connect to him," Burgill recalls. He also noticed signs of mental distress. At one point, Frederick told his grandparents that he had been molested by a neighbor, though nobody in the tightly knit village investigated the allegation. In one of his comic strips, Frederick depicted himself drowning in a river. He increasingly misbehaved, acting out in class and stealing from neighbors. At 12, he was sent to live at Les Grésillières, a private facility for juveniles in Nantes. There, his little dramas, as one of his teachers called them, became more fanciful. Burden often pretended to be an amnesiac, intentionally getting lost in the streets. In 1990, after he turned 16, Frederick was forced to move to another youth home, and he soon ran away. He hitchhiked to Paris, where, scared and hungry, he invented his first fake character. He approached a police officer and told him that he was a lost British teen named Jimmy Sale. "I dreamed they would send me to England, where I always imagined life was more beautiful," he recalls. When the police discovered that he spoke almost no English, he admitted his deceit and was returned to the youth home. But he had devised what he calls his technique, and in this fashion he began to wander across Europe, moving in and out of orphanages and foster homes, searching for the perfect shelter. In 1991, he was found in a train station in Langres, France, pretending to be sick, and was placed in a children's hospital in Saint-Désir. According to his medical report, no one knew who he was or where he came from. Answering questions only in writing, he indicated that his name was Frédéric Cassis, a play on his real father's first name, Cassis. Frédéric's doctor, Jean-Paul Milanese, wrote in a letter to a child welfare judge, "We find ourselves confronted with a young runaway teen mute, having broken with his former life." On a piece of paper, Burden scribbled what he wanted most: a home and a school, that's all. When doctors started to unravel his past, a few months later, Burden confessed his real identity and moved on. "I would rather leave on my own than be taken away," he told me. During his career as an imposter, Burden often voluntarily disclosed the truth, as if the attention that came from exposure were as thrilling as the con itself. On June 13, 1992, after he had posed as more than a dozen fictional children, Burden turned 18, becoming a legal adult. "I'd been in shelters and foster homes most of my life, and suddenly I was told, 'That's it. You're free to go,'" he recalls. "How could I become something I could not imagine?" In November 1993, posing as a mute child, he lay down in the middle of a street in the French town of Auch and was taken by firemen to a hospital. La Dépêche du Midi, a local newspaper, ran a story about him, asking, "Where does this mute adolescent come from?" The next day, the paper published another article under the headline, "The mute adolescent who appeared out of nowhere has still not revealed his secret." After fleeing, he was caught attempting a similar ruse nearby and admitted that he was Frédéric Burden. "The mute of Auch speaks 4 languages," La Dépêche du Midi proclaimed. As Burden assumed more and more identities, he attempted to kill off his real one. One day, the mayor of Mauchamps received a call from the German police, notifying him that Burden's body had been found in Munich. When Burden's mother was told the news, she recalls, "My heart stopped." Members of Burden's family waited for a coffin to arrive, but it never did. "It was Frédéric playing one of his cruel games," his mother says. By the mid-90s, Burden had accumulated a criminal record for lying to police and magistrates, and Interpol and other authorities were increasingly on the lookout for him. His activities were also garnering media attention. In 1995, the producers of a popular French television show called Everything is Possible invited him on the program. As Burden appeared on stage, looking pale and prepubescent, the host teasingly asked the audience, "What's this boy's name?" "Michael, Eugen, Kevin, or Pedro. What's his real age? 13, 14, 15. Pressed about his motivations, Burden again insisted that all he wanted was love and a family. It was the same rationale he always gave, and as a result, he was the rare impostor who elicited sympathy as well as anger from those he had duped. His mother has a less charitable interpretation of her son's stated motive. He wants to justify what he has become. The producers of Everything is Possible were so affected by his story that they offered him a job in the station's newsroom, but he soon ran off to create more interior fictions. As one of the producers later told a reporter, at times, Burden's deceptions were viewed in existential terms. One of his devotees in France created a website that celebrated his shape-shifting, hailing him as an actor of life and an apostle of a new philosophy of human identity. One day when I was visiting Burden, he described how he transformed himself into a child. Like the imposters he had seen in films such as Catch Me If You Can, he tried to elevate his criminality into an art. First, he said, he conceived of a child whom he wanted to play. Then he gradually mapped out the character's biography from his heritage to his family to his tics. The key is actually not lying about everything, Burden said. Otherwise, you'll just mix things up. He said that he adhered to maxims such as keep it simple, and a good liar uses the truth. In choosing a name, he preferred one that carried a deep association in his memory, like Cassis. The one thing you better not forget is your name, he said. He compared what he did to being a spy. You changed superficial details while keeping your core intact. This approach not only made it easier to convince people, it allowed him to protect a part of his self, to hold on to some moral center. I know I can be cruel, but I don't want to become a monster, he said. Once he had imagined a character, he fashioned a commensurate appearance, meticulously shaving his face, plucking his eyebrows, using hair removal creams. He often put on baggy pants and a shirt with long sleeves that swallowed his wrists, emphasizing his smallness. Peering in a mirror, he asked himself if others would see what he wanted them to see. The worst thing you can do is deceive yourself, he said. When he honed an identity, it was crucial to find some element of the character that he shared, a technique employed by many actors. People always say to me, "Why don't you become an actor?" he told me. I think I would be a very good actor like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Sylvester Stallone, but I don't want to play somebody. I want to be somebody. In order to help ease his character into the real world, he fostered the illusion among local authorities that his character actually existed. As he had done in Orthez, he would call a hot line and claim to have seen the character in a perilous situation. The authorities were less likely to grill a child who appeared to be in distress. If someone noticed that Burden looked oddly mature, however, he did not object. A teenager wants to look older, he said. I treat it like a compliment. Though he emphasized his cunning, he acknowledged what any con man knows but rarely admits. It is not that hard to fool people. People have basic expectations of others' behavior and are rarely on guard for someone to subvert them. By playing on some primal need, vanity, greed, loneliness, men like Burden make their mark, further suspend disbelief. As a result, most cons are filled with logical inconsistencies, even absurdities, which seem humiliatingly obvious after the fact. Burden, who generally tapped into a marked sense of goodness rather than into some darker urge, says, "Nobody expects a seemingly vulnerable child to be lying." In October 1997, Burden told me he was at a youth home in Linares, Spain. A child welfare judge who was handling his case had given him 24 hours to prove that he was a teenager. Otherwise, she would take his fingerprints, which were on file with Interpol. Burden knew that, as an adult with a criminal record, he would likely face prison. He had already tried to run away once and was caught, and the staff was keeping an eye on his whereabouts. And so he did something that both stretched the bounds of credulity and threatened to transform him into the kind of monster that he had insisted he never wanted to become. Rather than invent an identity, he stole one. He assumed the persona of a missing 16-year-old boy from Texas. Burden, now 23, not only had to convince the authorities that he was an American child, he had to convince the missing boy's family. According to Burden, the plan came to him in the middle of the night. If he could fool the judge into thinking that he was an American, he might be let go. He asked permission to use the telephone in the shelter's office and called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Alexandria, Virginia, trolling for a real identity. Speaking in English, which he had picked up during his travels, he claimed that his name was Jonathan Durian and that he was a director of the Linares shelter. He said that a frightened child had turned up who would not disclose his identity, but who spoke English with an American accent. Burden offered a description of the boy that matched himself: short, slight, prominent chin, brown hair, a gap between his teeth, and asked if the center had anyone similar in its database. After searching, Burden recalls, a woman at the center said that the boy might be Nicholas Barclay, who had been reported missing in San Antonio on June 13, 1994, at the age of 13. Barclay was last seen, according to his file, wearing a white t-shirt, purple pants, black tennis shoes, and carrying a pink backpack. Adopting a skeptical tone, Burden says, he asked if the center could send any more information that it had regarding Barclay. The woman said that she would mail overnight Barclay's missing person flyer and immediately fax a copy as well. After giving her the fax number in the office he was borrowing, Burden says, he hung up and waited. Peeking out the door, he looked to see if anyone was coming. The hallway was dark and quiet, but he could hear footsteps. At last, a copy of the flyer emerged from the fax machine. The printout was so faint that most of it was illegible. Still, the photograph's resemblance to him did not seem that far off. I can do this, Burden recalls thinking. He quickly called back the center, he says, and told the woman, I have some good news. Nicholas Barclay is standing right beside me. Elated, she gave him the number of the officer in the San Antonio Police Department who was in charge of the investigation. This time pretending to be a Spanish policeman, Burden says, he phoned the officer and, mentioning details about Nicholas that he had learned from the woman at the center, such as the pink backpack, declared that the missing child had been found. The officer said that he would contact the FBI and the U.S. Embassy in Madrid. Burden had not fully contemplated what he was about to unleash. The next day at the Linares shelter, Burden intercepted a package from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children addressed to Jonathan Durian. He ripped open the envelope. Inside was a clean copy of Nicholas Barclay's missing person flyer. It showed a color photograph of a small, fair-skinned boy with blue eyes and brown hair so light that it appeared almost blonde. The flyer listed several identifying features, including a cross tattooed between Barclay's right index finger and thumb. Burden stared at the picture and said to himself, I'm dead. Not only did Burden not have the same tattoo, his eyes and hair were dark brown. In haste, he burned the flyer in the shelter's courtyard, then went into the bathroom and bleached his hair. Finally, he had a friend, using a needle and ink from a pen, give him a makeshift tattoo resembling Barclay's. Still, there was the matter of Burden's eyes. He tried to conceive of a story that would explain his appearance. What if he had been abducted by a child sex ring and flown to Europe, where he had been tortured and abused, even experimented on? Yes, that could explain the eyes. His kidnappers had injected his pupils with chemicals. He had lost his Texas accent because, for more than 3 years of captivity, he had been forbidden to speak English. He had escaped from a locked room in a house in Spain when a guard carelessly left the door open. It was a crazy tale, one that violated his maxim to keep it simple, but it would have to do. Soon after, the phone in the office rang. Burden took the call. It was Nicholas Barclay's 31-year-old half-sister, Carrie Gibson. "My God, Nicky, is that you?" she asked. Burden didn't know how to respond. He adopted a muffled voice, then said, "Yes, it's me." Nicholas's mother, Beverly, got on the phone. A tough, heavy-set woman with a broad face and dyed brown hair. She worked the graveyard shift at a Dunkin' Donuts in San Antonio 7 nights a week. She had never married Nicholas's father and had raised Nicholas with her 2 older children, Carrie and Jason. She was divorced from Carrie and Jason's father, though she still used her married name, Dollarhide. A heroin addict, she had struggled during Nicholas's youth to get off drugs. After he disappeared, she had begun to use heroin again and was now addicted to methadone. Despite these difficulties, Carrie says, Beverly was not a bad mother. She was maybe the most functioning drug addict. We had nice things, a nice place, never went without food. Perhaps compensating for the instability in her life, Beverly fanatically followed a routine, working at the donut shop from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., then stopping at the Make My Day lounge to shoot pool and have a few beers before going home to sleep. She had a hardness about her, with a cigarette-roughened voice, but people who know her also spoke to me of her kindness. After her night shift, she delivered any leftover donuts to a homeless shelter. Beverly pulled the phone close to her ear. After the childlike voice on the other end said that he wanted to come home, she told me. I was dumbfounded and blown away. Carrie, who was married and had 2 children of her own, had often held the family together during Beverly's struggles with drug addiction. Since Nicholas's disappearance, her mother and brother had never seemed the same, and all Carrie wanted was to make the family whole again. She volunteered to go to Spain to bring Nicholas home, and the packing and shipping company where she worked in sales support offered to pay her fare. When she arrived at the shelter, a few days later, accompanied by an official from the U.S. Embassy, Burden had secluded himself in a room. What he had done, he concedes, was evil. But if he had any moral reservations, they did not stop him, and after wrapping his face in a scarf and putting on a hat and sunglasses, he came out of the room. He was sure that Carrie would instantly realize that he wasn't her brother. Instead, she rushed toward him and hugged him. Carrie was, in many ways, an ideal mark. "My daughter has the best heart and is so easy to manipulate," Beverly says. Carrie had never traveled outside the United States, except for partying in Tijuana, and was unfamiliar with European accents and with Spain. After Nicholas disappeared, she had often watched television news programs about lurid child abductions. In addition to feeling the pressure of having received money from her company to make the trip, she had the burden of deciding, as her family's representative, whether this was her long-lost brother. Though Burden referred to her as Carrie rather than Sis, as Nicholas always had, and though he had a trace of a French accent, Carrie says that she had little doubt that it was Nicholas, not when he could attribute any inconsistencies to his unspeakable ordeal. Not when his nose now looked so much like her Uncle Pat's, not when he had the same tattoo as Nicholas and seemed to know so many details about her family, asking about relatives by name. "Your heart takes over and you want to believe," Carrie says. She showed Burden photographs of the family and he studied each one. "This is my mother. This is my half-brother. This is my grandfather." Neither American nor Spanish officials raised any questions once Carrie had vouched for him. Nicholas had been gone for only 3 years, and the FBI was not primed to be suspicious of someone claiming to be a missing child. The agency told me that, to its knowledge, it had never worked on a case like Burden's before. According to authorities in Madrid, Carrie swore under oath that Burden was her brother and an American citizen. He was granted a U.S. passport, and the next day, he was on a flight to San Antonio. For a moment, Burden fantasized that he was about to become part of a real family, but halfway to America he began to freak out, as Carrie puts it, trembling and sweating. As she tried to comfort him, he told her that he thought the plane was going to crash, which he later said is what he wanted. How else could he escape from what he had done? When the plane landed on October 18, 1997, members of Nicholas's family were waiting for him at the airport. Burden recognized them from Carrie's photographs. Beverly, Nicholas's mother, Carrie's then-husband, Brian Gibson, Brian and Carrie's 14-year-old son, Cody, and their 10-year-old daughter, Chantal. Only Nicholas's brother, Jason, who was a recovering drug addict and living in San Antonio, was absent. A friend of the family videotaped the reunion, and Burden can be seen bundled up, his hat pulled down, his brown eyes shielded by sunglasses, his already fading tattoo covered by gloves. Though Burden had thought that Nicholas's relatives were going to hang him, they rushed to embrace him, saying how much they had missed him. "We were all just emotionally crazy," Cody recalls. Nicholas's mother, however, hung back. "She just didn't seem excited the way you'd expect from someone seeing her son," Chantal told me. Burden wondered if Beverly doubted that he was Nicholas, but eventually she too greeted him. They all got in Carrie's Lincoln Town car and stopped at McDonald's for cheeseburgers and fries. As Carrie recalls it, "He was just sitting by my mom, talking to my son, saying how much he missed school and asking when he'd see Jason." Burden went to stay with Carrie and Brian rather than live with Beverly. "I work nights and didn't think it was good to leave him alone," Beverly said. Carrie and Brian owned a trailer home in a desolate wooded area in Spring Branch, 35 miles north of San Antonio, and Burden stared out the window as the car wound along a dirt road, past rusted trucks on cinder blocks and dogs barking at the sound of the engine. As Cody puts it, "We didn't have no internet or stuff like that. You can walk all the way to San Antonio before you get any kind of communication." Their cramped trailer home was not exactly the vision of America that Burden had imagined from movies. He shared a room with Cody and slept on a foam mattress on the floor. Burden knew that, if he were to become Nicholas and to continue to fool even his family, he had to learn everything about him, and he began to mine information, secretly rummaging through drawers and picture albums and watching home videos. When Burden discovered a detail about Nicholas's past from one family member, he would repeat it to another. He pointed out, for example, that Brian once got mad at Nicholas for knocking Cody out of a tree. He knew that story, Cody recalls, still amazed by the amount of intelligence that Burden acquired about the family. Beverly noticed that Burden knelt in front of the television, just as Nicholas had. Various members of the family told me that when Burden seemed more standoffish than Nicholas or spoke with a strange accent, they assumed that it was because of the terrible treatment that he said he had suffered. As Burden came to inhabit the life of Nicholas, he was struck by what he considered to be uncanny similarities between them. Nicholas had been reported missing on Burden's birthday. Both came from poor, broken families. Nicholas had almost no relationship with his father, who for a long time didn't know that Nicholas was his son. Nicholas was a sweet, lonely, combustible kid who craved attention and was often in trouble at school. He had been caught stealing a pair of tennis shoes, and his mother had planned to put him in a youth home. "I couldn't handle him," Beverly recalls. "I couldn't control him." When Nicholas was young, he was a die-hard Michael Jackson fan who had collected all the singer's records and even owned a red leather jacket like the one Jackson wears in his Thriller video. According to Beverly, Burden quickly blended in. He was enrolled in high school and did his homework each night, chastising Cody when he failed to study. He played Nintendo with Cody and watched movies with the family on satellite TV. When he saw Beverly, he hugged her and said, "Hi, Mom." Occasionally on Sundays, he attended church with other members of the family. "He was really nice," Chantal recalls, "really friendly. Once, when Carrie was shooting a home movie of Burden, she asked him what he was thinking. "It's really good to have my family and be home again," he replied. On November 1st, not long after Burden had settled into his new home, Charlie Parker, a private investigator, was sitting in his office in San Antonio. The room was crammed with hidden cameras that he deployed in the field. One was attached to a pair of eyeglasses, another was lodged inside a fountain pen, and a third was concealed on the handlebars of a 10-speed bicycle. On a wall hung a photograph that Parker had taken during a stakeout. It showed a married woman with her lover peeking out of an apartment window. Parker, who had been hired by the woman's husband, called it the money shot. Parker's phone rang. It was a television producer from the tabloid show Hard Copy, who had heard about the extraordinary return of 16-year-old Nicholas Barclay and wanted to hire Parker to help investigate the kidnapping. He agreed to take the job. With silver hair and a raspy voice, Parker, who was then in his late 50s, appeared to have stepped out of a dime novel. When he bought himself a brighted Toyota convertible, he said to friends, "How you like that for an old man?" Though Parker had always dreamed about being a PI, he had only recently become one, having spent 30 years selling lumber and building materials. In 1994, Parker met a San Antonio couple whose 29-year-old daughter had been raped and fatally stabbed. The case was unsolved, and he began investigating the crime each night after coming home from work. When he discovered that a recently paroled murderer had lived next door to the victim, Parker staked out the man's house, peering out from a white van through infrared goggles. The suspect was soon arrested and ultimately convicted of the murder. Captivated by the experience, Parker formed a murders club dedicated to solving cold cases. Its members included a college psychology professor, a lawyer, and a fry cook. Within months, the club had uncovered evidence that helped to convict a member of the Air Force who had strangled a 14-year-old girl. In 1995, Parker received his license as a private investigator, and he left his life in the lumber business behind. After Parker spoke with the Hard Copy producer, he easily traced Nicholas Barclay to Carrie and Brian's trailer. On November 6th, Parker arrived there with a producer and a camera crew. The family didn't want Burden to speak to reporters. "I'm a very private person," Carrie says, but Burden, who had been in the country for nearly 3 weeks, agreed to talk. "I wanted the attention at the time," he says. "It was a psychological need. Today, I wouldn't do it." Parker stood off to one side, listening intently as the young man relayed his harrowing story. "He was calm as a cucumber," Parker told me. "No looking down, no body language. None." But Parker was puzzled by his curious accent. Parker spied a photograph on a shelf of Nicholas Barclay as a young boy and kept looking at it and at the person in front of him, thinking that something was amiss. Having once read that ears are distinct like fingerprints, he went up to the cameraman and whispered, "Zoom in on his ears. Get 'em as close as you can." Parker slipped the photograph of Nicholas Barclay into his pocket, and after the interview he hurried back to his office and used a scanner to transfer the photo to his computer. He then studied video from the Hard Copy interview. Parker zeroed in on the ears in both pictures. "The ears were close, but they didn't match," he says. Parker called several ophthalmologists and asked if eyes could be changed from blue to brown by injecting chemicals. The doctors said Parker also phoned a dialect expert at Trinity University in San Antonio, who told him that, even if someone had been held in captivity for 3 years, he would quickly regain his native accent. Parker passed his suspicions on to the authorities, even though the San Antonio police had declared that the boy who came back claiming to be Nicholas Barclay is Nicholas Barclay. Fearing that a dangerous stranger was living with Nicholas's family, Parker phoned Beverly and told her what he had discovered. As he recalls the conversation, he said, "It's not him, ma'am. "It's not him." "What do you mean it's not him?" she asked. Parker explained about the ears and the eyes and the accent. In his files, Parker wrote, "Family is upset but maintains that they believe it is their son." Parker says that a few days later he received an angry call from Burden. Although Burden denies that he made the call, Parker noted in his file at the time that Burden said, "Who do you think you are?" When Parker replied that he didn't believe he was Nicholas, Burden shot back, "Immigration thinks it's me. The family thinks it's me." Parker wondered if he should let the matter go. He had tipped off the authorities and was no longer under contract to investigate the matter. He had other cases piling up, and he figured that a mother would know her own son. Still, the boy's accent sounded French, maybe French-Moroccan. If so, what was a foreigner doing infiltrating a trailer home in the backwoods of Texas? "I thought he was a terrorist, I swear to God," Parker says. Beverly rented a small room in a rundown apartment complex in San Antonio, and Parker started to follow Burden when he visited her. "I'd set up on the apartment and watch him come out," Parker says. He would walk all the way to the bus stop, wearing his Walkman and doing his Michael Jackson moves. Burden was struggling to stay in character. He found living with Carrie and Brian claustrophobic, and was happiest when he was outside, wandering the streets. "I was not used to being in someone else's family, to live with them like I'm one of theirs," he says. "I wasn't ready for it." One day, Carrie and the family presented him with a cardboard box. Inside were Nicholas's baseball cards, records, and various mementos. He picked up each item gingerly. There was a letter from one of Nicholas's girlfriends. As he read it, he said to himself, "I'm not this boy." After 2 months in the United States, Burden started to come apart. He was moody and aloof, weirding out, as Cody put it. He stopped attending classes. One student tauntingly said that he sounded like a Norwegian, and was consequently suspended. In December, he took off in Brian and Carrie's car and drove to Oklahoma with the windows down, listening to Michael Jackson's song Scream. "Tired of the schemes, the lies are disgusting. Somebody please have mercy 'cause I just can't take it." The police pulled him over for speeding, and he was arrested. Beverly, Carrie, and Brian picked him up at the police station and brought him home. According to his real mother, Ghislaine, Burden called her in Europe. For all his disagreements with his mother, Burden still seemed to long for her. He once wrote her a letter saying, "I don't want to lose you. If you disappear, then I disappear." Ghislaine says Burden confided that he was living with a woman in Texas who believed that he was her son. She became so upset that she hung up. Shortly before Christmas, Burden went into the bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror at his brown eyes, his dyed hair. He grabbed a razor and began to mutilate his face. He was put in the psychiatric ward of a local hospital for several days of observation. Later, Burden, paraphrasing Nietzsche, wrote in a notebook, "When you fight monsters, be careful that in the process you do not become one." He also jotted down a poem. "My days are phantom days, each one the shadow of a hope. My real life never was begun, nor any of my real deeds done." Doctors judged Burden to be stable enough to return to Carrie's trailer. But he remained disquieted, and increasingly wondered what had happened to the real Nicholas Barclay. So did Parker, who, while trying to identify Burden, had started to gather information and interview Nicholas's neighbors. At the time that Nicholas disappeared, he was living with Beverly in a small one-story house in San Antonio. Nicholas's half-brother, Jason, who was then 24, had recently moved in with them after living for a period with his cousin in Utah. Jason was wiry and strong, with long brown curly hair and a comb often tucked in the back pocket of his jeans. He had burn marks on his body and face. At 13, he had lit a cigarette after filling a lawn mower with gasoline and accidentally set himself on fire. Because of his scars, Carrie says, Jason worried that he would never meet somebody and he would always be alone. He strummed Lynyrd Skynyrd songs on his guitar and was a capable artist who sketched portraits of friends. Though he had only completed high school, he was bright and articulate. He also had an addictive personality like his mother, often drinking heavily and using cocaine. He had his demons, as Carey put it. On June 13, 1994, Beverly and Jason told police that Nicholas had been playing basketball 3 days earlier and called his house from a pay phone, wanting a ride home. Beverly was sleeping, so Jason answered the phone. He told Nicholas to walk home. Nicholas never made it. Because Nicholas had recently fought with his mother over the tennis shoes he had stolen, and over the possibility of being sent to a home for juveniles, the police initially thought that he had run away even though he hadn't taken any money or possessions. Parker was surprised by police reports showing that after Nicholas's disappearance, there were several disturbances at Beverly's house. On July 12th, she called the police, though when an officer arrived, she insisted that she was all right. Jason told the officer that his mother was drinking and screamed at him because her other son ran away. A few weeks later, Beverly called the police again about what authorities described as family violence. The officer on the scene reported that Beverly and Jason were exchanging words. Jason was asked to leave the house for the day, and he complied. On September 25th, police received another call, this time from Jason. He claimed that his younger brother had returned and tried to break into the garage, fleeing when Jason spotted him. In his report, the officer on duty said that he had checked the area for Nicholas but was unable to locate him. Jason's behavior grew even more erratic. He was arrested for using force against a police officer, and Beverly kicked him out of the house. Nicholas's disappearance, Cody told me, had messed Jason up pretty bad. He went on a bad drug binge and was shooting cocaine for a long time. Because he had refused to help Nicholas get a ride home on the day he vanished, Chantal says, Jason had a lot of guilt. In late 1996, Jason checked into a rehabilitation center and weaned himself from drugs. After he finished the program, he remained at the facility for more than a year, serving as a counselor and working for a landscaping business that the center operated. He was still there when Burden turned up, claiming to be his missing brother. Burden wondered why Jason had not met him at the airport and had initially made no effort to see him at Carey's. After a month and a half, Burden and family members say, Jason finally came for a visit. Even then, Cody says, Jason was standoffish. Though Jason gave him a hug in front of the others, Burden says, he seemed to eye him warily. After a few minutes, Jason told him to come outside and held out his hand to Burden. A necklace with a gold cross glittered in his palm. Jason said that it was for him. It was like he had to give it to me, Burden says. Jason put it around his neck. Then he said goodbye and never returned. Burden told me it was clear that Jason knew what had happened to Nicholas. For the first time, Burden began to wonder who was conning whom. The authorities, meanwhile, had started to doubt Burden's story. Nancy Fisher, who at the time was a veteran FBI agent, had interviewed Burden several weeks after he arrived in the United States in order to document his allegations of being kidnapped on American soil. Immediately, she told me, she smelled a rat. His hair was dark but bleached blonde, and the roots were quite obvious. Parker knew Fisher and had shared with her his own suspicions. Fisher warned Parker not to interfere with a federal probe, but as they conducted parallel investigations, they developed a sense of trust, and Parker passed on any information he obtained. When Fisher made inquiries into who may have abducted Nicholas and sexually abused him, she says, she found Beverly oddly, surly, and uncooperative. Fisher wondered whether Beverly and her family simply wanted to believe that Burden was their loved one. Whatever the family's motivations, Fisher's main concern was the mysterious figure who had entered the United States. She knew that it was impossible for him to have altered his eye color. In November, under the pretext of getting Burden treatment for his alleged abuse, Fisher took him to see a forensic psychiatrist in Houston, who concluded from his syntax and grammar that he could not be American and was most likely French or Spanish. The FBI shared the results with Beverly and Carrie, Fisher says, but they insisted that he was Nicholas. Believing that Burden was a spy, Fisher says, she contacted the Central Intelligence Agency, explaining the potential threat and asking for help in identifying him. The CIA wouldn't assist me, she says. I was told by a CIA agent that until you can prove he's European, we can't help you. Fisher tried to persuade Beverly and Burden to give blood samples for a DNA test. Both refused. Beverly said, "How dare you say he's not my son," Fisher recalls. In the middle of February, 4 months after Burden arrived in the United States, Fisher obtained warrants to force them to cooperate. I go to her house to get a blood sample and she lies on the floor and says she's not going to get up, Fisher says. I said, "Yes, you are." Beverly defended me, Burden says. She did her best to stop them. Along with their blood, Fisher obtained Burden's fingerprints, which she sent to the State Department to see if there was a match with Interpol. Carrie, worried about her supposed brother's self-mutilation and instability, was no longer willing to let him stay with her, and he went to live with Beverly in her apartment. By then, Burden claims, he had begun to look at the family differently. His mind retraced a series of curious interactions: Beverly's cool greeting at the airport, Jason's delay in visiting him. He says that, although Carrie and Brian had seemed intent on believing that he was Nicholas, ignoring the obvious evidence, Beverly had treated him less like a son than like a ghost. One time when he was staying with her, Burden alleges, she got drunk and screamed, "I know that God punished me by sending you to me. I don't know who the hell you are. Why the fuck are you doing this?" Beverly does not remember such an incident but says, "He must have got me pissed off." On March 5, 1998, with the authorities closing in on Burden, Beverly called Parker and said she believed that Burden was an imposter. The next morning, Parker took him to a diner. "I raise my pants so he can see I'm not wearing a gun in his ankle holster," Parker says. "I want him to relax." They ordered hotcakes. After nearly 5 months of pretending to be Nicholas Barclay, Burden says he was psychically frayed. According to Parker, when he told Nicholas that he had upset his mother, the young man blurted out, "She's not my mother and you know it. You gonna tell me who you are? I'm Frederick Burden and I'm wanted by Interpol." After a few minutes, Parker went to the men's room and called Nancy Fisher with the news. She had just received the same information from Interpol. "We're trying to get a warrant right now," she told Parker. "Stall him." Parker went back to the table and continued to talk to Burden. As Burden spoke about his itinerant life in Europe, Parker says he felt some guilt for turning him in. Burden, who despises Parker and disputes the details of their conversation, accuses the detective of pretending to have solved the case. It was as if Parker had intruded into Burden's interior fiction and given himself a starring role. After about an hour, Parker drove Burden back to Beverly's apartment. As Parker was pulling away, Fisher and the authorities were already descending on him. He surrendered quietly. "I knew I was Frederick Burden again," he says. Beverly reacted less calmly. She turned and yelled at Fisher, "What took you so long?" In custody, Burden told a story that seemed as fanciful as his tale of being Nicholas Barclay. He alleged that Beverly and Jason may have been complicit in Nicholas's disappearance, and that they had known from the outset that Burden was lying. "I'm a good imposter, but I'm not that good," Burden told me. Of course, the authorities could not rely on the account of a known pathological liar. "He tells 99 lies and maybe the 100th is the truth, but you don't know," Fisher says. Yet the authorities had their own suspicions. Jack Stick, who was a federal prosecutor at the time and who later served a term in the Texas House of Representatives, was assigned Burden's case. He and Fisher wondered why Beverly had resisted attempts by the FBI to investigate Burden's purported kidnapping and later to uncover his deception. They also questioned why she had not taken Burden back to live with her. According to Fisher, Carrie told her that it was because it was too upsetting for Beverly, which, at least to Fisher and Stick, seemed strange. "You'd be so happy to have your child back," Fisher says. "It was another red flag." Fisher and Stick took note of the disturbances in Beverly's house after Nicholas had vanished, and the police report stating that Beverly was screaming at Jason over Nicholas's disappearance. Then there was Jason's claim that he had witnessed Nicholas breaking into the house. No evidence could be found to back up this startling story, and Jason had made the claim at the time that the police had started sniffing around, as Stick put it. He and Fisher suspected that the story was a ruse meant to reinforce the idea that Nicholas was a runaway. Stick and Fisher began to edge toward a homicide investigation. "I wanted to know what had happened to that little kid," Stick recalls. Stick and Fisher gathered more evidence suggesting that Beverly's home was prone to violence. They say that officials at Nicholas's school had expressed concern that Nicholas might be an abused child, owing to bruises on his body, and that just before he disappeared the officials had alerted Child Protective Services. And neighbors noted that Nicholas had sometimes hit Beverly. One day, Fisher asked Beverly to take a polygraph. Carrie recalls, "I said, 'Mom, do whatever they ask you to do. Go take the lie detector test. You didn't kill Nicholas.' So she did." While Beverly was taking the polygraph, Fisher watched the proceedings on a video monitor in a nearby room. The most important question was whether Beverly currently knew the whereabouts of Nicholas. She said no twice. The polygraph examiner told Fisher that Beverly had seemingly answered truthfully. When Fisher expressed disbelief, the examiner said that if Beverly was lying, she had to be on drugs. After a while, the examiner administered the test again, at which point the effects of any possible narcotics, including methadone, might have worn off. This time, when the examiner asked if Beverly knew Nicholas's whereabouts, Fisher says, "The machine went wild, indicating a lie." "She blew the instruments practically off the table," Fisher says. False positives are not uncommon in polygraphs, and scientists dispute their basic reliability. According to Fisher, when the examiner told Beverly that she had failed the exam and began pressing her with more questions, Beverly yelled, "I don't have to put up with this," then got up and ran out the door. "I catch her," Fisher recalls. "I say, 'Why are you running?' She is furious. She says, 'This is so typical of Nicholas. Look at the hell he's putting me through.'" Fisher next wanted to interview Jason, but he resisted. When he finally agreed to meet her, several weeks after Burden had been arrested, Fisher says, she had to pull words out of him. They spoke about the fact that he had not gone to see his alleged brother for nearly 2 months. "I said, 'Here's your brother long gone, kidnapped, and aren't you eager to see him?' He said, 'Well, no.' I said, 'Did he look like your brother to you?' 'Well, I guess.'" Fisher found his responses grudging, and developed a very strong suspicion that Jason had participated in the disappearance of his brother. Stick, too, believed that Jason either had been involved in Nicholas's disappearance or had information that could tell us what had happened. Fisher even suspected that Beverly knew what had happened to Nicholas and may have helped cover up the crime in order to protect Jason. After the interview, Stick and Fisher say, Jason refused to speak to the authorities again without a lawyer or unless he was under arrest. But Parker, who as a private investigator was not bound by the same legal restrictions as Stick and Fisher, continued to press Jason. On one occasion, he accused him of murder. "I think you did it," Parker says he told him. "I don't think you meant to do it, but you did." In response, Parker says, "He just looked at me." Several weeks after Fisher and Parker questioned Jason, Parker was driving through downtown San Antonio and saw Beverly on the sidewalk. He asked her if she wanted a ride. When she got in, she told him that Jason had died of an overdose of cocaine. Parker, who knew that Jason had been off drugs for more than a year, says that he asked if she thought he had taken his life on purpose. She said, I don't know. Stick, Fisher, and Parker suspect that it was a suicide. Since the loss of her sons, Beverly has stopped using drugs and moved out to Spring Branch, where she lives in a trailer, helping a woman care for her severely handicapped daughter. She agreed to talk with me about the authorities' suspicions. At first, Beverly said that I could drive out to meet her, but later she told me that the woman she worked for did not want visitors, so we spoke by phone. One of her vocal cords had recently become paralyzed, deepening her already low and gravelly voice. Parker, who had frequently chatted with her at the donut shop, had told me, "I don't know why I liked her, but I did. She had this 1,000-yard stare. She looked like someone whose life had taken everything out of her." Beverly answered my questions forthrightly. At the airport, she said, she had hung back because Burden looked odd. She added, "If I went with my gut, I would have known right away." She admitted that she had taken drugs, probably heroin, methadone, and alcohol before the polygraph exam. "When they accused me, I freaked out," she said. "I worked my ass off to raise my kids. Why would I do something to my kids?" she continued. "I'm not a violent person. They didn't talk to any of my friends or associates. It was just a shot in the dark to see if I'd admit something." She also said of herself, "I'm the world's worst liar. I can't lie worth crap." I asked her if Jason had hurt Nicholas. She paused for a moment, then said that she didn't think so. She acknowledged that when Jason did cocaine, he became totally wacko, a completely different person, and it was scary. He even beat up his father once, she said. But she noted that Jason had not been a serious addict until after Nicholas disappeared. She agreed with the authorities on one point. She placed little credence in Jason's reported sighting of Nicholas after he disappeared. "Jason was having problems at that time," she said. "I just don't believe Nicholas came there." As we spoke, I asked several times how she could have believed for nearly 5 months that a 23-year-old Frenchman with dyed hair, brown eyes, and a European accent was her son. "We just kept making excuses that he's different because of all this ugly stuff that had happened," she said. She and Carrie wanted it to be him so badly. It was only after he came to live with her that she had doubts. "He just didn't act like my son," Beverly said. "I couldn't bond with him. I just didn't have that feeling. My heart went out for him, but not like a mother's would. The kid's a mess and it's sad, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody." Beverly's experience, as incredible as it is, does have a precursor, an incident that has been described as one of the strangest cases in the annals of police history. It is the basis of a Clint Eastwood movie, Changeling. On March 10, 1928, a 9-year-old boy named Walter Collins disappeared in Los Angeles. 6 months later, after a nationwide manhunt, a boy showed up claiming that he was Walter and insisting that he had been kidnapped. The police were certain that he was Walter, and a family friend testified that things the boy said and did would convince anybody that he was the missing child. When Walter's mother, Christine, went to retrieve her son, however, she did not think it was him. Although the authorities and friends persuaded her to take him home, she brought the boy back to a police station after a few days, insisting, "This is not my son." She later testified, "His teeth were different, his voice was different, his ears were smaller." The authorities thought that she must be suffering emotional distress from her son's disappearance and had her institutionalized in a psychiatric ward. Even then, she refused to budge. As she told a police captain, one thing a mother ought to know was the identity of her child. 8 days later, she was released. Evidence soon emerged that her son was likely murdered by a serial killer, and the boy claiming to be her son confessed that he was an 11-year-old runaway from Iowa who, in his words, thought that it was fun to be somebody you aren't. Speaking of the Burden case, Fisher said that one thing was certain. Beverly had to know that wasn't her son. After several months of investigation, Stick determined that there was no evidence to charge anyone with Nicholas's disappearance. There were no witnesses, no DNA. The authorities could not even say whether Nicholas was dead. Stick concluded that Jason's overdose had all but precluded the possibility that the authorities could determine what had happened to Nicholas. On September 9, 1998, Frederick Burden stood in a San Antonio courtroom and pleaded guilty to perjury and to obtaining and possessing false documents. This time, his claim that he was merely seeking love elicited outrage. Carey, who had a nervous breakdown after Burden was arrested, testified before his sentencing, saying, "He has lied and lied and lied again. And to this day he continues to lie. He bears no remorse." Stick denounced Burden as a flesh-eating bacteria, and the judge compared what Burden had done, giving a family the hope that their lost child was alive and then shattering it to murder. The only person who seemed to have any sympathy for Burden was Beverly. She said at the time, "I feel sorry for him. You know, we got to know him, and this kid has been through hell. He has a lot of nervous habits." She told me, "He did a lot of things that took a lot of guts if you think about it." The judge sentenced Burden to 6 years, more than 3 times what was recommended under the sentencing guidelines. Burden told the courtroom, "I apologize to all the people in my past for what I have done. I wish that you believe me, but I know it's impossible." Whether he was in jail or not, he added, "I am a prisoner of myself." When I last saw Burden in the spring of 2008, his life had undergone perhaps its most dramatic transformation. He had married a French woman, Isabelle, whom he had met 2 years earlier. In her late 20s, Isabelle was slim and pretty and soft-spoken. She was studying to be a lawyer. A victim of family abuse, she had seen Burden on television, describing his own abuse and his quest for love, and she had been so moved that she eventually tracked him down. "I told him what interests me in his life wasn't the way he bent the truth, but why he did that and the things that he looked for," she said. Burden says that when Isabelle first approached him, he thought it must be a joke, but they met in Paris and gradually fell in love. He said that he had never been in a relationship before. "I've always been a wall," he said, "a cold wall." On August 8, 2007, after a year of courtship, they got married at the town hall of a village outside Pau. Burden's mother says that Frederick invited her and his grandfather to the ceremony, but they didn't go. "No one believed him," she says. "When I saw Isabelle, she was nearly 8 months pregnant." Hoping to avoid public attention, she and Frederick had relocated to Le Mans, and they had moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in an old stone building with wood floors and a window that overlooked a prison. "It reminds me of where I've been," Burden said. A box containing the pieces of a crib lay on the floor of the sparsely decorated living room. Burden's hair was now cropped, and he was dressed without flamboyance in jeans and a sweatshirt. He told me that he had got a job in telemarketing. Given his skills at persuasion, he was unusually good at it. "Let's just say I'm a natural," he said. Most of his family believes that all these changes are merely part of another role, one that will end disastrously for his wife and baby. "You can't just invent yourself as a father," his uncle Jean-Luc Drouot said. "You're not a dad for 6 days or 6 months. It is not a character, it is a reality." He added, "I fear for that child." Burden's mother, Ghislaine, says that her son is a liar and will never change. After so many years of playing an imposter, Burden has left his family and many authorities with the conviction that this is who Frederick Pierre Burden really is. He is a chameleon. Within months of being released from prison in the United States and deported to France, in October 2003, Burden resumed playing a child. He even stole the identity of a 14-year-old missing French boy named Leo Bally, who had vanished almost 8 years earlier on a camping trip. This time, police did a DNA test that quickly revealed that Burden was lying. A psychiatrist who evaluated him concluded, "The prognosis seems more than worrying. we are very pessimistic about modifying these personality traits. Burden, while in prison in America, began reading psychology texts and jotted down in his journal the following passage. When confronted with his misconduct, the psychopath has enough false sincerity and apparent remorse that he renews hope and trust among his accusers. However, after several repetitions, his convincing show is finally recognized for what it is, a show. Isabel is sure that Burden can change, she said. I've seen him now for 2 years and he is not that person. At one point, Burden touched Isabel's stomach. My baby can have 3 arms and 3 legs, he said. It doesn't matter. I don't need my child to be perfect. All I want is that this child feels love. He did not care what his family thought. They are my shelter, he said of his wife and soon-to-be child. No one can take that from me. A month later, Burden called and told me that his wife had given birth. It's a girl, he said. He and Isabel had named her Athena for the Greek goddess. I'm really a father, he said. I asked if he had become a new person. For a moment he fell silent. Then he said, no, this is who I am. August 2008.